Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the Social Media Summit at MIT, which is going to be very, very good. I'm Andy McAfee. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. For those of you who don't know us, the IDE is an initiative dedicated to exploring how people and businesses are going to work, interact, and prosper in this era of profound digital transformation. Today, we're bringing together the world leaders in social technology to examine one of the most critical and compelling issues of our time, the impact of social media. We're going to be focused on action, which is one of the things that I think is going to be most valuable about this summit. We're going to work on creating a vision to craft meaningful solutions to the social media crisis. This is a free event and open to the public, and it's enabled by our friends at MIT Sloan Management Review, MIT Technology Review, PopTech, Ogilvy, Rappler, and Ivy. We are recording this event, and it will be available using the same webcast link from now going forward. And now it's my pleasure to welcome the Dean of MIT Sloan, David Schmittlein, to say a few words.
Hi, I'm Dave Schmittlein, Dean of the MIT Sloan School of Management. Welcome, and thank you for participating in this virtual event. It's great to see so many alumni and students and faculty and friends of the MIT Sloan School participating, and also members of the general public. I want to take a minute to thank our speakers, an extraordinary collection of people whose insights are amazing into the world of social media and how these technologies affect economies and democracies and societies. It's a real testament to the initiative on the digital economy to be able to bring together this kind of event. And I'm grateful to the partnership between the IDE and the MIT Sloan Office of External Relations to bring this to you in this way. For the initiative on the digital economy, I want to acknowledge Sinan Aral, Andy McAfee, David Verrill, and Kerry Reynolds. And for the MIT Sloan Office of External Relations, recognize Patsy Thompson and Lauren Wojcik and Haley Lamson. At MIT, our mission is simple: to invent a positive future. And in order to do that, we have to work on and solve the most important challenges of our time and the time ahead. Social media is certainly one of those. It affects every individual and every organization. And we're fortunate at MIT to have faculty who have extraordinary insight and expertise with respect to social media. And a leader among those leaders is our host today, Professor Sinan Aral. Sinan is the faculty director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy and is also the author of the recent book, The Hype Machine, which illustrates how these technologies both function and thrive. This kind of insight provides a foundation for the sessions that you'll see here during this event. You know, if we're going to understand social media, we have to think about the ways that there are checks and balances with respect to the benefits and the downsides. We have a benefit in the ability to communicate more broadly and more deeply, but we also have to be attentive to disinformation. Social media can enhance free speech, but also enhance harmful speech. Social media can enhance participative democracy, but can also reduce the stability of those democracies. You'll see speakers who have a variety of perspectives on these opportunities and challenges, and you'll have a great opportunity to learn as well as to participate. In that regard, I hope that you will take action based on what you experience during this event. Bring it into your life in some way, your work life, your personal life, the insights, the experiences that you hear about here, talk about them. Share your thoughts with the panelists. And more broadly, continue to engage with MIT and its Sloan School of Management. And if you can, invest to help support our activities including specifically the activities of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. Now I'm delighted to turn you over to the host of this event. As I mentioned, it's Sinan Aral. Sinan is the David Austin Professor of Management at MIT Sloan. He's a professor of information technology and marketing at the school. And he's also the faculty director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy. Sinan, I turn it over to you. Participants, please enjoy an extraordinary event.
Thanks, Dave. Hey, everybody, welcome. I'm Sinan Aral. I'm the director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. And on behalf of our amazing team, I'd like to welcome you to the first Social Media Summit at MIT. So I'm extremely honored to be your host for today's event, really for three basic reasons. First, if you've taken a look at the speaker lineup, you know that it's a virtual who's who of deep thinkers, entrepreneurs, journalists, scientists, business leaders, policymakers, platform leaders, really at the forefront of the social economy. The brain trust contributing to this conversation we have in store for you today is truly remarkable. Everyone is participating without pay, voluntarily. I'm so honored these people trusted us to convene, curate, and guide this conversation today at MIT. They're all incredibly busy people, so I'm just so thrilled that we'll be able to speak to them today. Second, I'm so proud and humbled to be part of this amazing team at the IDE at MIT. I'm actually a product of this institute, and I pinch myself every day to still be part of it. I have to thank just a few people, if you'll bear with me. First, our MIT IDE sponsors and research partners. Without them and without you, we wouldn't exist. So thank you for your continued support. My partner in crime and IDE co-director, Andy McAfee, our executive director, David Verrill, associate director, Devin Cook, our research leaders who really are the lifeblood of the work that we do, John Horton, Dave Rand, Dean Eccles, Renee Gosline, and Sandy Pentland. And of course, the rest of our executive team and staff. These are the people that make the IDE tick, and without them, none of this would be possible. I'm just so proud of all of them. Last and furthest from the least on this list is Carrie Reynolds, who wears many hats at the IDE and is basically single-handedly responsible for putting on this event. Carrie, without you, there'd be no Social Media Summit and many other things. So thank you for all your hard work these past months. So the final reason I'm so honored to host this event is the importance of the topic itself. So it's become impossible to ignore the dramatic impacts that social technologies are having today. You really can't turn on your TV or listen to a podcast without hearing some story ripped from the headlines about how social media is disrupting our lives. And today we are truly at a crossroads. You know, governments worldwide right now are thinking about how to regulate this technology, and the platforms are thinking about how to change and are changing, instituting new policies, adjusting their designs to try to ameliorate some of these harmful effects that they've admitted before Congresses and parliaments that in some ways they're contributing to. Some people think they're not moving fast enough. The platforms think that they're doing their best. But what we do next over the next 18 to 24 months is going to have an outsized impact on every facet of our society. Social media is rewiring the central nervous system of humanity as we speak, and we have to be thoughtful about how we guide and direct it. So I'm a huge fan of books like Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, who, as I was a PhD student growing up at MIT, she's a luminary in the field. Books like Zucked by Roger McNamee, movies like The Social Dilemma, The Great Hack, and now Coded Bias. I really encourage everyone to watch these movies, read these books. These have raised the clarion call of the urgency of the situation. Now we have to get past the debate about whether social media is good or evil, because the answer is yes to both. So the general approach of the Social Media Summit will be to focus on solutions, to answer the question, what can we concretely do to fix the social media crises we find ourselves in. So towards this end, in each panel, I'll begin by briefly describing the specific problems we address in the panel, and then to direct us to devote our time, interaction, and effort in the panel to thinking about and discussing the specific, detailed, and nuanced solutions we might pursue to solve these specific problems. So the panels are organized thematically to core areas of harms and solutions. We have panels on rescuing truth, ensuring transparency, reviving competition, humanizing design, enlightening business models, and restoring speech. And at lunch, we'll have a fireside conversation with Nick Clegg, who's the global head of PR for one of these platforms, Facebook, during the lunch hour. So we've got a lot to get to today, and our panelists truly need no introduction. So I'm going to skip the lengthy formal introductions of each panelist in each panel and try to get right to the meat of the topics and the substance of the issues. I want to point out one final thing, which is that I go to a lot of tech conferences, and one thing that tech conferences struggle with is gender and ethnic diversity, having more women and more people of color as leaders of the conversation. And we worked very hard today to make sure that we had both minority representation as well as gender diversity. We've achieved 50%, 50-50 male-female diversity on every panel. And we have good representation from people of color, not just Black folks, but also brown, Asian, and I think this is really important. And the reason I think this is important, and as we'll see on the panel on humanizing design, the diversity of who leads these conversations is part of our problem. Not any conference is perfect on these issues, but we've worked really hard to try and get representation in order to make sure that the conversation is being led and steered in the right directions. So with that, thank you all for joining us. And again, welcome to the first Social Media Summit at MIT. We'll jump right into our first panel on rescuing truth in just a few seconds. Thanks. All right, so as I said, we're really excited to be here today for our first panel, which is about misinformation, falsity, and how we can rescue truth in our modern society. So rescuing truth requires thoughtful discourse on fake news, its general principles, its genesis, its propagation, its consequences, and most importantly, its solutions. You know, current events push us towards threats to our democracies, our economies, our public health during the coronavirus pandemic and beyond. So this session will engage some of the world's top experts on the spread of falsity, conspiracy cults, and social media manipulation, both foreign and domestic. We want to explore real solutions to the abuse of news communication technologies, from cyber warfare to online harassment, from conspiracy theories to political and economic terrorism. We've got a great panel. Camille Francois, Chief Innovation Officer of Graphica, Maria Ressa, CEO of Rappler and a Time Person of the Year in 2018, Ali Velshi, host of Velshi and business correspondent at NBC, and Clint Watts, who is Senior Fellow at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security and wears many other hats as well. Former FBI agent, I would add. So misinformation and disinformation have always existed. You know, I think the first time fake news was mentioned was in a Harper's Magazine article in the 1920s. But several things are different today. First, the speed with which information moves online has accelerated so much that it's given falsity an advantage over truth. So we saw in our study, our 10-year study of Twitter here at MIT that was published in Science, that false news travels farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information. Second, we don't all experience a common transparent information ecosystem, right? Targeting and personalized news feeds make it hard to see who sees what and what types of assumptions people base their behaviors on. And this makes it hard to uncover the spread of falsity. Third, the consequences are magnified today because our lives are so much more interdependent. Take one current topic as an example, vaccinations. Others' decisions to vaccinate will affect your kids and your parents. So today we want to focus on solutions. We want to discuss the policies, design decisions, norms, business model innovations that'll make most meaningful differences to promote truth and curb falsity on social media and in our society at large. And we want to do this without avoiding the hardest, deepest questions like who gets to decide what's true and what's false? I've heard a lot of people say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. But is there really an objective reality that we can grasp, that can be grasped? Is it similarly identifiable in every sphere? For example, is truth in politics as clear as truth in science? Is truth in science even clear? And how exactly do we grasp these truths? So, Maria, I want to start with you because you have lived and are still living in the middle of an information war, a misinformation war, designed to discredit you, to discredit the Rappler organization as a voice of opposition in the Philippines. There have been countless articles written about it. There have been movies made about it. You were a Time Person of the Year in 2018 because of it in part. And you're facing significant jail time based on the accusations that have been made against you. So welcome. Thank you for taking time to be here with us today. First, how are you? How are you holding up?
Oh, please unmute.
The first thing is unmute, right? So, Tsinan, first, thank you for having me. How am I? Well, look, in less than 2 years, the Philippine government filed 10 arrest warrants against me. The most recent one was just January this year. I have 9 ongoing cases. In order to stay free and to keep doing my job, I've had to post bail, right? I'm going to just quickly correct, two things. One is Rappler is not opposition. Rappler is a news organization, but it just turns out that holding power to account nowadays, you get painted into a corner, not because necessarily of what you write, but because of, I'm going to use the words exponential propaganda, right? So when you say opposition, I think over time, the excesses that we have documented has made the government's claim we are opposition true in some people's minds. And then I think the second one is since 2016, we really have documented disinformation, networks of disinformation, meaning this is a push for power and it is insidious manipulation. Look, I'm good because I think this time matters. You know this, so we fight it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That is an important thing to point out. And I want to get right into what you began to talk about. So tell us a little bit in your own words for the purpose of the audience and just to, form a basis for our conversation. What have you experienced over the last several years? And what role has online and social media disinformation and misinformation played in that experience? What specific tactics and strategies did the propagators of the disinformation campaigns use, and how effective were they?
Extremely effective. I thought technology in 2012 was going to be an enabler for building institutions bottom up, helping build our institutions here. But by 2016, which is when we began sounding the alarm, we began to see the kinds of seeding of meta-narratives on social media, exponential attacks against me and Rappler. And in my case, the meta-narrative that was seeded in 2016 is journalist equals criminal, right? I've been a journalist. This is my 35th year that I've been a journalist. And in 2016, I laughed because I thought, oh, how can people believe that? Well, Your paper actually said this in Nature magazine in 2018. You showed that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further on social media. The world's largest distributor of news is Facebook. 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. Facebook is our internet. Rappler began on Facebook. So there's all of that. So this bottom up exponential attacks, the reason that's important is it does two things. It pounds you to silence, and then it creates a bandwagon effect, makes other people believe that this is a fact, right? Then that was followed, the seeding was followed by top down. In 2017, President Duterte in his State of the Nation address said the same thing. Journalist equals criminal. Rappler is a criminal, right? In so many words. A week later, we get the first subpoena. In 2018, we get 8 charges and investigations. So 8 cases. In 2019, I was arrested. In February, so in about 5 weeks, I was arrested twice. I had to post bail 8 times in 2019. In 2020, in the summer, I was convicted for a story that was published 8 years earlier for a law that didn't exist, for allegedly violating. That's under appeal. So I'm fighting 9 cases in court. And then of course in 2021, that's this year, I get my 10th arrest warrant. So it hasn't stopped. But I guess the key part here is it's not unique to us. It's the same exact methodology used in the United States, the meta-narrative of election fraud, right? You've shown this in the United States. But more than that, I think it's that it is happening in every democracy around the world where social media delivers the news.
So today we really want to focus on solutions. So if, let's say, I could make a, wave a magic wand, and I could put you in a position to tell Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, and the other leaders of the new social age, what exactly should they be doing to prevent what you've experienced? What would you say? What are the policies and tactics you would want to see the platforms adopt most urgently?
I think the first thing is admit that they have helped create this problem, right? Because we know these platforms. I mean, Facebook, when it was late in going to mobile, it was able to pivot in 2 years. And I had hoped that Facebook would do something like this. So the first is admit the problem. The second is, please don't treat the data equally. This is in your book, in the hype machine, right? Fact and fiction, lies and facts are identically treated as data. And the way the algorithms work is it actually prioritizes the spread of the lies. And then I think finally is to really, it's enlightened self-interest to understand that by watering facts down, that if they allow the lies to spread faster, without facts, we have no shared reality. So you have no facts, you have no truth, you have no trust. Without any of this, was it George Shultz who said, everything is possible with trust? Without trust, nothing is possible. So without these 3, you cannot have democracy, let alone solve the existential problems that we're facing in the world: climate change, coronavirus, truth.
So what about policymakers? So what would you tell Filipino legislatures or congressmen and women in the United States more broadly? What would you tell policymakers? What should they be doing?
So for Filipino legislators, the Philippine government, I mean, we have shown this in the data since 2016. The government has used this to its advantage. It's one of the governments that have been enabled, that is insidiously manipulating its people on the social media platforms. I think that, like the United States, the opposition has no idea how to handle this. And unlike the United States, they still haven't gotten to a point. We have presidential elections next year. They haven't gotten to a point, because there are only 2 ways you can do this, right? You either use the scorched earth policy of lies, or you actually, I don't even know what to do if you're not going to use the social media platforms. For the United States, hello, folks. These are American companies. This is actually your problem. it's just, it ripples to us. And it is the countries in the global south that pay the worst price for the excesses of American companies. So look, I appeal for help on this, because partly how fast you move will determine whether or not I go to jail. We have the EU, the European Democracy Action Plan, looking at that. I have you looking at the UK Online Harms Bill and Section 230, right? These loopholes you've allowed. I mean, we've talked about this forever. So I'll shut up because I want to hear everyone else in this amazing day that you put together, Seenan.
So we've got a whole panel on restoring speech. We're going to get right into Section 230 later today. Thank you for teeing that up. One final question for you. So what do you say to critics who say, look, people have a right to their opinions. They have a right to express their opinions, and whatever opinions they hold. Many people in the Philippines support the president. Where's the line between the legitimate right to hold those other views and the illegitimacy, I should say, of the propagation of misinformation and disinformation that impacts Filipino politics and global geopolitics more broadly?
Global geopolitics is the main thing because everything is about power and money, right? And we see this playing out on social media. Look, you said it. You're entitled to your opinion. You're not entitled to your facts. How do you do that, right? I think the key part is that real grassroots movements should not be compared to insidious manipulation. And the social media platforms, frankly, can't distinguish the difference. There was just a paper that came out today on AstraZeneca and how bots have jumped into the fray, and how known disinformation networks from India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, how these have jumped into the discussion. Real people who are on social media can't tell the difference. And that has led to the reason why real people are being manipulated. Look at the United States. The people who came out on Capitol Hill, right? They believe this. And it's like being infected by, if we have coronavirus in the real world, here in the information ecosystem, you have the virus of lies. And in some ways, you can say that the virus of lies coming in is worse because you don't see it, you don't feel it, it changes your worldview, and it makes you impervious to facts. Our societies are going to have to fix this.
Thank you, Maria. It's great to have you here. Clint, I want to turn to you because you've not only studied and written extensively about foreign misinformation campaigns directed at destabilizing democracy from outside, but also more recently you've been tracking domestic terrorist organizations and the use of social media and online misinformation in mobilizing, legitimizing, and coordinating those types of organizations, for example, in the United States. So how important is misinformation and disinformation to the ability of foreign governments to destabilize democracies from the outside? And how important is misinformation in mobilizing, legitimizing, and coordinating domestic terror groups from within a democracy? You know, how's social media used in foreign interventions and by domestic terror groups? Can you give us specific structured examples?
Yes, thanks for having me. And thanks, Hanan, for asking that question, because I think the biggest lesson that challenges what the US and many democracies do is that there's some imaginary line between foreign and domestic, and there is no such thing. There's just information and there's just a world now. And in the online space, I'll give you a specific example, and then I want to rewind 10 years, if that's okay, which is the first campaign that I took Russian disinformation seriously was Jade Helm exercise in Texas in 2015, which was a conspiracy that the US was sending military trainers down to Texas in order to ultimately declare martial law and take everyone's weapons. And it seemed like crazy. It was even on the Daily Show. Jon Stewart talked about it. It was like this funny conspiracy. But it was effective enough that the governor of Texas actually deployed monitors to watch US soldiers in Texas. Now, we were watching foreign amplification. They didn't create that conspiracy, but they knew that it was something that was driving a state or local government, state and local officials, a local population against, and an extremist position against the federal government. So that was a great opportunity to mobilize domestic extremism and sort of rally the cause. 10 years before that, one of our challenges at the US government is we wanted to fight extremism around the world. And one of the things we were trying to do was elevate what was called moderate voices. It was literally, the program was called Moderate Voices, which was how do we help moderate voices kind of counter extremist messaging around the world? Because there was no real content. There wasn't any content to grab onto because there's asymmetry in the information space. Some countries can control the information, like Maria was talking about. She's in a totally different environment than what's here in the United States. If you're in Russia, you have one version of the internet where many things are controlled, but not entirely. If you're in China, it is a completely different system. So your ability to use a domestic misinformation or truth is really dependent on the architecture of the internet, in those regions that surround those cultures. And so in the US, the toughest thing about really sustaining the disinformation campaign is availability of content over time. User-generated content, misinformation, and conspiracies allow all of our adversaries, America and really democracy's adversaries around the world, an unlimited and very cheap way to deliver a sustained message that is anti-US. You don't even have to advance an alternative, you just have to destroy the existing status quo. And so that's why the US system as it stands today is just a ripe opportunity for anyone that wants to get inside the United States and create havoc. If that's extremist, if it's around amplifying vaccine misinformation through additional disinformation, trust in elected officials and institutions, trust in the free media and the free press, that is all easily done, and you don't have to create anything. You can find it, amplify it, and drive it. I think that's the asymmetry of the internet that we've arrived to today that continues. It's our strength and our greatest weakness at the same time.
Thank you. So solutions. What specifically should the social platforms be doing to curb the spread of misinformation?
So one area that I probably disagree with to some extent from what I see in terms of recommendation is policing content. If you are always in a status of policing content, you will always lose for several reasons. One, content can be created faster than it can be policed, and it puts the defenders at such a disadvantage that you can't do it. The second part is just completely undermines what it means to be an American or a free citizen of democracy, whatever your country is. You're trying to tell people what not to say. It just doesn't work, right? And that's part of the battle that we see in our own political discourse today is you can't tell me what to say. I have freedoms, but you shouldn't be allowed to yell fire in a movie theater, on scale around the world. So we have this sort of diametric thing. What I am more interested in is what we came to actually in counterterrorism and in cybersecurity, which is focusing on the most prolific offenders over time. And what I think we see consistently in any one of these disinformation or misinformation campaigns is it ultimately comes down to the biggest offenders are a very small network of offenders, meaning there's a small group of people that we actually know a lot about now compared to 5 or 6 years ago. And if you can focus on them, you have a better chance of making a sizable impact in the environment. And so it's interesting when I talk to military crowds, they totally get it. I'll say to them, I was like, if you're suffering an artillery barrage, would you run around and try and catch all the artillery rounds, or would you go after the gun? And they immediately go, well, the phrase in the military is silence the guns. That's what we would say, be like, you run towards the guns, you don't run away. And so it's interesting when we put it in a different context, we kind of get it. And I think we're moving in that direction. The one thing, Sanan, that you put in the notes, which I thought was super important, which was crowdsourcing. That's actually how I got into this business of disinformation. I was doing crowdsourcing experiments around the war on terror and countering extremism. What are the best techniques? And I found that, the more I studied it, the more I learned about the wisdom of crowds, the more I started to listen to the wisdom of outliers. Meaning that because crowds can be manipulated so bad, it's very hard to use crowdsourcing techniques to police social media, because it comes down to the majority rule, and the majority rule on each platform is different. each platform is designed and tailored and catered to a different majority. So it can be effective, particularly for certain things like acute incidents of like, did an explosion happen at this location? Did this event actually occur? That can be helpful. But the further you get from an event to opinion, it starts to get incredibly distorted. There's like a aftershock or ripple effect. And the last thing I would conclude with is that we are starting to solve the defense approach, but truth will only win if it goes on the offense. And so that's pretty much where I'm focusing almost all of my efforts today, is on the offense side. I think we've got great defenders, so many of them on this on these panels today. They're all doing amazing stuff. This whole field didn't exist really 5 or 6 years ago, and now look at how far we've come. But I think the next frontier is really, how do we make sure that truth wins?
Camille, you've been studying and tracking misinformation for years, and from every angle, whether it's political misinformation or health misinformation, economic misinformation. What have you seen that has worked best to curb falsity anywhere in the world? What are the top solution concepts in your view?
Yeah, thanks, Ned. That's a great question. When I think about it, I think the first thing that needs to be said is that in that domain, regulatory pressure and public pressure has worked. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but when you think back to the time that Clint was talking about a handful of years ago, 5 years ago, we were talking about these issues. I was even working with Maria on this concept of patriotic trolling, right? How we could demonstrate that government around the world were using fake accounts to harass their critics, to silence journalists, and nobody cared in Silicon Valley, frankly. And what we've seen with 2016, with the Russian influence in the 2016 election, is after that, around 2017, 2018, starts a really strong congressional and public pressure campaign for Silicon Valley that says you can and will create rules for this type of content, properly resource teams to go after it, and share data. And I think that now we kind of live in this reality where, of course, they have rules against these subtypes of activity. Of course, that they have investigators that systematically go after, find those fake accounts, and of course they share the data, but this wasn't the case. And I think it's important to take a step back and say, we need to continue investing in these types of congressional and public pressure because they work. And, having this data come to the surface, again, isn't perfect. We're still lacking a lot of data. We still want much more, but it helped confirm very important things about how these campaigns work and who is behind it, right? To Clint's point, we now know that they are indeed very strong, very well organized network that systematically use these tactics. We have worked on campaigns that actually show that what Maria was seeing and documenting were indeed fake accounts. Some of them actually, we can trace back to government. And I think that I don't want to be the overly optimistic one here, but I think that that's the first win that we have to recognize, because 5 years ago, when you talked about this, people would tell you, oh yeah, isn't it too bad that people are mean on the internet? And it wasn't treated like the issue that it really is, with the investment that it deserves, including on finding the truth for this. For me, there was a pivotal moment when we started saying, the same way we attribute a cyber incident, the same way nobody would ever be satisfied if I tell you there's been a major cyber attack. Isn't it bad? Stuff happened on the internet. Now we're going to do this for sophisticated disinformation campaign. When that happens, we're going to say, what happened? Where's the data? How are we going to avoid this? And can we attribute it? I think that's really important. And that leads me to sort of the answer to your question is, we must continue investing in these types of pressure, and we must continue investing in the researchers and journalists and investigative reporters who've continually uncovered these campaigns. I think there's sometimes this sort of false perception that only governments and platforms uncover this campaign. That's simply not true, right? That's not what history taught us. We need to make sure that this independent researchers and the media have access to the tools, to the data, to the support they need to continue shining a light on these networks and shining a light on the opposite of truth, those sophisticated campaigns.
So Clint mentioned the sort of supply side, demand side question. Do we suppress this by going after the creation and distribution, or do we also work on the demand side? I'm personally of the opinion that we need to do both. Where do you think are the points of highest leverage against falsity? Is it with the platforms? their moderation policies and algorithms? Is it with public education? Is it with regulation?
Can I say all of the above? I believe in all
Yes,
of
you
the
can.
above. I think that regulation has a really important role to play. I think, again, empowering defenders is critical. What I'm also encouraged by is, I think in 2020, we saw platforms consider a little bit more seriously the role of design in stopping the spread of these campaigns. We saw, for instance, Twitter say, we're going to change the way people engage with the share button on Twitter to see if that helps slow the pace of mis and disinformation. That was new, and I think that is important. We have now sort of, we're on the other side of this pivotal moment where we can have a serious conversation and saying, okay, we need to experiment with different design approaches. There are really thoughtful researchers who are also doing this in a sort of like well-organized experimental way, right? How can we imagine other spaces? What are the design features that we need and deserve? How can we roll them out and how can we test them? I'm personally really encouraged to see that we're finally here. None of the, social media architecture that we live with is something that we have to live with forever, right? Opening the can of worms of what are the different social media infrastructure that we can reimagine is for me something that gives me a lot of optimism.
Awesome. And we've got a great panel on ensuring transparency later, where getting inside and making and opening this up is a big part of this conversation. So, Ali, I know this is a topic of special interest for you. You've spoken quite passionately about this. You've given TED Talks about it. So why is this topic so important to you? I mean, falsity has been around for a long time. Why do you think it's so important we focus on it and find solutions to it now?
I don't talk about it a ton, but my family really for the last 125 years has been in search of democracy. My family was in South Africa. They couldn't vote. They were anti-apartheid activists. They moved to the West because of democracy. My father ran for office and got elected, sort of broke some barriers doing that. Little did I think 50 years ago when my parents, first set foot on North American shores that one day we'd actually be having discussions about democracy being at risk. But that's what we've seen. And Clint and I have discussed this for a few years, and you and I have discussed it for a few years, that at some point that there is falsity out there is one thing, that we are risking democracy is quite another. And I am out there. In fact, as soon as I finish this conversation, I'm going into a park in Minneapolis where I'm going to be sitting with 6 people. And I've been doing this every week, almost every week for a year, where I get opinions from people and their political opinions, and whether it's about coronavirus or the elections, or in this case in Minneapolis about social justice. And I think when Maria said we don't have a shared reality, that's what the problem is. I'm such a strong believer in the freedom of speech. I'm such a strong believer in pluralism and the competition for ideas. But that's not where we are. We are literally having conversations about what actually happened in this particular incident between police and George Floyd, or about what's actually happening with vaccines and coronavirus infection rates, and whether or not masks stopped the spread, or whether or not the election was stolen. So what we're not having discussions on is, in fact, some of the sophisticated stuff that our panelists are talking about. My viewers out there, or people with whom I talk, are not necessarily having those conversations, because they're having a different battle that they shouldn't be having. We shouldn't be discussing the validity of the election. If we're talking about election fraud, we should be discussing the few but important incidents where that takes place, as opposed to suggesting that an election didn't happen as a result. And it resonates into my job. So after I have this conversation with 6 people from Minneapolis, I'm going to go to Brooklyn Center, which is where Dante Wright was shot last week by police. And it's still hot. His funeral is happening today. And, there was you're not supposed to prevent the media from getting access to these places. You're not supposed to bully the media. You're not supposed to arrest the media. And the media is not subject to curfew. But there were a lot of arrests and detentions last week. And then on Friday night, a federal judge in Minneapolis restated and sort of put out an order that you can't detain and arrest and harass and intimidate the media without cause. If they are not actually interfering in public safety matters, you can't do that. Guess what? more reporters got detained, put on the floor, their badges photographed. Now, who cares? It's 2021. Who cares what's photographed? Our badges are all out there. But to Maria's point, it's a small local form of intimidation, which suggests that those of us who exist to bear witness have that interfered with. So that's number one. If you're going to protect democracy and create a shared reality for people, journalists have two responsibilities, exactly two, both of which Maria is engaged in and in trouble for. One is bearing witness. Just tell people what's happening. This is what's happening. This is what police are doing right here, or this is what's happening in this election. And two is hold power to account. Now, if you are trying to hold power to account, but the power you are trying to hold to account is using its power simply to discredit you, not to argue with you, not to debate you, not to say that you've misinterpreted what they're doing, but simply to discredit you. Over time, in a society that does not have a shared experience, that grows. And that has grown into our widespread distrust of media. It has grown into people who have their own set of facts, as you pointed out. It's grown into a situation where it doesn't matter that I go to talk to people and I go armed with evidence about economics, which is what I specialize in, or coronavirus spreads or instances of police brutality. It doesn't matter. It no longer matters what evidence I put forward because, like Maria, much of the media has been painted with this brush that suggests you're just lying. So if you're lying about everything. And hence, you never get to the discussion about what should good policing look like? What should the election fraud prevention look like? What should greater voter access look like? What should the minimum wage be? How should we deal with the application of healthcare across this country? You can't have those discussions because you're constantly a few steps behind fighting lies. And if you ignore them, which, boy, would I like to do some days, you all know what happens. You can't actually ignore them. You can't actually decide they're not there because it erodes your base of people who will, look to you for information, and you end up talking to a smaller and smaller group of people.
Amen. I got to ask you about the role of the media here. I mean, I think it's safe to say that in the United States, our media, our cable news networks and so on are incredibly polarized. How does the media contribute to this problem, and how can the media contribute to the solution, specifically when journalists like yourself are trying to combat misinformation, but the two sides aren't listening to each other? What can you do when the myths that you'd like to debunk aren't believed by the people who are listening to you, but by the people who don't listen to you?
So that's the problem, right? I don't, when people say people don't trust the media, my viewers trust me and distrust someone else. Someone else's viewers trust them and distrust me. So it's not that everybody distrusts all the media, it's that half the people distrust half the media. And that's an issue because with each conversation I have, with each show that I have, we strengthen the bubble. What I would love to do is have more viewers who don't watch me, have people who don't talk to me, have people who aren't listening to me engage in a discussion which challenges my own assumptions about things without crossing over that line that our previous panelists have addressed, in that there are some absolute truths, but sometimes there are sides to stories. And what we have decided is, and it is a cable news problem, is that there aren't two sides to a story. In fact, in many stories, there are multiple sides. Sinan, you and I have talked about how to deal with disinformation on social media many times. And I know your Twitter feed and mine both light up afterwards with well-intentioned people who think you're on the wrong side of this issue, or think I might be on the wrong side of this issue. And the following week, I'll interview somebody else who's at odds with your position on it or what you stated in your book. And that's okay. Having good discussions about multiple approaches to a common problem, a shared problem, is a good thing. But we have to figure out, without amplifying dishonesty and lies and things that are not based in fact, how do we amplify pluralism? How do we amplify that there are many ways to approach certain issues, including social media, including healthcare, including wages, including policing? So maybe we need to do a better job of saying, we're telling you, if not the whole story, I'd like it if we told the whole story. We're telling you much more of the story. What it becomes very easy to do is understand the thing that my audience has an appetite for, and cherry pick the pieces of the story that they're going to most enjoy or nod or clap for. I don't know, and I'm speaking very, very broadly. I don't know that that's the right solution. I think individually, there are many of us who try not to do that, who try to give lots of voice to different views without crossing a line into that's untruthful, and I'm amplifying that. But understanding how to get people to get back into high school debate mode or college debate mode and say, we're going to have to find different ideas and be accepting of them. It's not just one way.
So I want to, before I go to a couple of questions from participants, I want to give you all a very easy softball question and get you all to give a brief answer to it in turn. So the question is, one underlying, thing that underlines everything we're talking about today is, how do we decide as a society what's true and false? Who should get to decide that? Is it the platforms? Is it the governments, the fact checkers? And who's checking the fact checkers, by the way? Or is it the crowd? Is it majority opinion of the crowd? Is that a good barometer for truth and falsity? How do we decide what's true and what's false? Who gets to decide? Maria, what do you think?
Oh my lordy. So see then, some things are not debatable. There are 5 of us on this panel. There are 3 men and 2 women. Pop, what we say, you can quote it, and then you can add your opinion. But some things are not debatable. Facts are not debatable. And to pretend they are, which is what some folks do, is actually leading us down the road to hell.
Clint.
I would say there's a couple things we can do. One is the 5 W's. Much to what Maria was saying, if I was a government intelligence analyst, I would be stripped down to 200 words, right? For what a fact would be. I would have to describe it and annotate it. I think the other thing is evaluating outlets and authors over time for fact versus fiction, and letting the audience that's receiving the information know the degree to which something is news and opinion, fact versus falsity, like a rating over time. And NewsGuard does a version of this that I do like. I think those are going to be more effective. And the third thing I think we need to do is digital verification of video, audio. That's coming. You can manipulate that and say through blockchain or some system, this is actual recording or video of an event that occurred.
Wow, that last piece, I think we need a whole conference on that. That's going to be huge as deep fakes and generative adversarial networks become more powerful. Camille.
Yeah, I think we should focus on who has access to the data and the means to answer this question, because I think ultimately, we have a process, right? I believe in the media on some topics. I believe in the wisdom of the crowd. I believe in congressional inquiries. I believe in rigorous academic research and the scientific method. And I think if we manage to get these, data and again, like means and research in the hand of all these processes, we can go further. So I think we have the answer. The question is, how do we make sure that all these systems can work in the current environment?
Ali?
So I'll address this more specifically to media. One of the issues which people have trouble with is having conflated opinion or bias with reliability. And I think we think they're all bad. There's absolutely nothing wrong with opinion. There's nothing wrong with bias. We have had it since the day there was a spoken or carved out of a stone word. That's not the enemy. Opinion and bias are not the enemy. Unreliability is the enemy. Dishonesty is the enemy. Falsity is the enemy. So we have to decide that I can like and consume and debate with something or somebody who does not share my opinion at all on anything, as long as they are telling the truth. We have decided that people who don't tell your story or your narrative are lying. There's your side and there's the wrong side. And I think that's something that I don't know how we specifically address that in the media, but we need to sort of say opinion is fine. You might want to signpost it very clearly from what is news, but opinion is fine. Bias is fine. It's part of human nature. Lying is dangerous, and the ignoring of facts is dangerous.
Thank you. So I want to take at the end a couple of questions from the audience. One question for Clint: are there examples of truth going on the offense?
I think so. Part of the reason it is not successful lately is we're stuck in the 1950s analog press conference mode. and we watch our adversaries scale their message, both in terms of technical automation and in terms of coordination. But we seem to want to not do that when we're trying to elevate facts. We are relying on the traditional media to a large degree, and they're doing great, but they have the limits to which they could reach audiences that Ali was talking about that don't want to listen to them. So you have to take it to the next step. If we were doing this as a political campaign, I don't think we should, but if you watch what a political campaign does, they don't leave any voter unturned, right? Like they move to where the most decisive votes are, where the people that need the information are to change their perceptions around things. We can use very similar approaches. It's scribbled on my crazy board there. It is a diagram we were making. That's what that is. There'll be a much less awful version that'll come out in a couple of days, but this was around coronavirus, and the vaccines, but there are ways to do what I call an information envelopment for facts, in terms of getting them there. And we've gotten better. I don't want to say that we haven't, but we got to get away from one person behind a podium hoping they will deliver a message to everyone that needs to hear it.
So maybe I'll direct this one to Camille. What about encrypted technologies? We've got a lot of end-to-end encryption. We know that misinformation travels there. It's much less transparent. How do we curb misinformation and disinformation in the encrypted channels?
Yeah, I think that encrypted technology is really important if we want to preserve everything we're talking about, right? If we're saying we want to make sure that the internet can be used for people to organize themselves to defend democracy around the world, then we need these encrypted technologies. We need these encrypted channels. Does that sometimes make it frustrating? Because you'd like to know what's happening and you'd like to know, what types of disinformation circulates in there? Yes, absolutely. But this is the fact of the infrastructure that we have. And in that specific case, I think that, again, end-to-end encrypted communication channels are important for what we want, for people to be able to fight for the truth, for people to be able to organize for democracy, and shouldn't be held as sort of, the enemy of mis and disinformation research. There are other ways in which we can tackle this problem that are just not, let's look at everything that people are saying to one another.
So first of all, let me just say, I completely agree with you. And so I guess to sharpen the question, there must be ways, and you just alluded to it, that we can think about the spread of misinformation in encrypted channels, where the solution isn't decrypt the encrypted channels or put backdoors in there for governments. Certainly agree that private communications are a really important part of democracy, but there might be sort of demand side or supply side or design principles. For example, WhatsApp limited reshares from 5 to 1, to 5, then from 5 to 1, just to sort of slow all information down to allow truth to catch up with falsity. That does not involve decryption. Is there some solutions that preserve encryption as an important private communication channel, but also address misinformation without knowing what's being said?
Absolutely. And you just cited one of them. I'm really interested in, again, those design interventions that are focused on slowing the pace. The other thing, of course, is there are parts of that infrastructure that can be seen. And I'm also interested in saying, okay, well, what can we share, right? Like, can we share sort of overall growth of groups? Can we share most popular links, right? Like, what are the set of sort of landscape, perimeters that we can share and keep in mind? So yes, I think it's going to be a design challenge. The other thing is, it is rarely the case that what happens in encrypted channels is fundamentally very different than what happens on the rest of the internet. When we have a large-scale conspiratorial community problem, we do have this everywhere, right? QAnon has never been, for instance, an encrypted communication problem. It's a whole of the internet problem. And so I think we should start by tackling the part of it that is reaching, everybody, really, that are reaching the masses and that is dominating our information environment. Those are rarely in the encryption channels.
So another question is about we've got a whole panel later today about speech and about regulating speech and how do we deal with that. But should governments be regulating false speech on social media more, or is this incredibly dangerous? So, what are the risks of governments making laws about false speech, especially in authoritarian regimes? Could they be used to suppress opinions that the government doesn't want to see? Maria, I'm going to go to you for this one. But, for example, should the civil liability shield that platforms get from Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in the United States be curtailed in the context of some types of false speech? And what are the risks of government regulation of false, quote unquote, false speech? Maria?
I mean, look, jumping off from Camille, the biggest problem is really still scale and frequency, right? That's because in the end, the models we have are all about the human brain having the capacity to absorb. And we've gotten the technology to the point that it is beyond that. So, you asking about government, I think the first step before government steps in would be to hold the platforms accountable for the way that they have designed the platform that allows this, right? And I guess that's also saying that I want the government to step in. It's not a free speech issue. It's the architecture of distribution that is the problem, and what is amplified. Sacha Baron Cohen said it first, right? It's a problem of reach. It's not about freedom of speech. It's the scale of what gets scale, the reach. And I think if you take the laws in the physical world, like you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, you can't yell bomb at the airport. Well, people do this all the time on social media with impunity. Information operations happen all the time on social media with impunity, right? And that is actually both on the social media platforms and on governments who are also taking part in the information operations. You guys know Russia had had targeted Americans in 2016, and that these information operations continue. That continues with impunity. Let's take the real world laws and bring it into the virtual world. I think that's the first step before you go to, so what will the government do? And then I think the second one is understand that, like Ali, you're talking about, we want people to be rational. That's what journalism is. It's actually rational, and we're rationally giving you different perspectives. But social media is not. It's emotional. It manipulates your emotions. So journalism and democracy and solving any problems is a thinking slow process. Social media and the distribution is a thinking fast process. These things have to come together, and we have to find a way forward that doesn't kill our democracies.
So, Ali, I want to come to you in 1 second, but a couple of points of cleanup that I want to do. Maria, you just said, you referenced Danny Kahneman, thinking fast, thinking slow, that the knee-jerk reactions are what create the distribution, the architecture of distribution as you described it. I want to point everybody to a paper that my colleagues David Rand and Dean Eccles just published in Nature with a bunch of their colleagues that show that accuracy nudging people to think about accuracy, reduces the belief in and spread of misinformation. That's an example of tipping people back into the thinking slow mentality. And it's kind of a design intervention that could be effective at scale at reducing the belief in and spread of misinformation. I want to clean up two other things. There was a question from the audience that said, is the elephant in the room the profit motive? Is there any solution without recognizing how much money is made enabling disinformation? I want to point that questioner to the panel on enlightening business models that we'll have later today. It will be an entire hour focused on that question. Another question from the audience: the difference between bias and falsity is very thin sometimes. What is more dangerous? I want to point that questioner to the panel on humanizing design, where we're going to talk to Safia Noble and others about bias in social media algorithms and how we can address solutions to that. Ali, I want to go to you because I think you had a reaction to the encryption question, and I also want to get your take on government regulation of falsity.
Yeah, and I think Maria just articulated that better than I could. That I really don't think we need greater regulation of speech. I think one of the roles we as media can play, particularly at the level that I operate, which is a little lower than what some of these other panelists do in terms of understanding the mechanics of it. At the level that I operate, this idea that we are welcoming people and their opinions into the conversation, because there is a sense that we invalidate opinions that are not ours. And some people look at people like me and people like Maria and say, you're on the other side, you're invalidating our opinions. But as I talk to regular folks out there about the matters that I discuss with them, to Camille's point, they don't a lot of people I talk to have never been part of QAnon. They're not part of any messaging process. They are consuming this information on Facebook or in other forms of social media. It then makes its way out into their circles. They don't know that. If I asked a number of people who I interview whether they are adherents of Q, they'll say no. Whether they're familiar with QAnon conspiracy theories, they'll say no. And yet, in the days leading up to the election, when I asked people who they're supporting for president, someone would say Donald Trump, and I'd say why? And they'd say because he's going to fight child sex trafficking, and Democrats, participate in child sex trafficking. My issue is, if we believe that child sex trafficking is an important issue, and it is, and we want to have a discussion about how we're combating that, and you're actually making your decisions about voting on the basis of that, let's actually talk about that. But we're not. We're having a discussion that is causing people to behave a certain way politically based on falsehoods that they cannot even identify. So at least if somebody yells fire in a theater, you can either determine that you can see them, hear them, and understand what the situation is in the theater around you. Is there smoke? Is there fire? But on social media, you're getting these things out there at a speed much faster than the human brain can operate, and no one has an ability to discern. So you've just sort of decided, this is my circle. If this is what they're saying, then that must be true. And I just gave you one example, but there are plenty. On any topic we want to discuss, I'm not having a conservative versus liberal or anywhere in the middle conversation. I'm having a truth versus BS conversation in most cases. I can't give up on that because it's my job. I talk to people and I'm going to keep doing it, but that is what makes it very difficult. If we can just have truth versus truth, because there are different options, there are different ways we can solve problems, but I'm not. I'm having a truth versus BS conversation fed by social media disinformation.
Truth versus truth. I love it. I'm going to go to Clint, then Maria, then Camille. Clint, a question from the audience about deepfakes. Isn't that the next big threat? And to what extent are you concerned about such synthetic media? I want to broaden a little bit. Deepfake video, obviously, but also deepfake audio. I mean, we've got a lot of new audio channels coming up. I think that, fake audio is an issue, fake video. What do you think?
I'm worried about audio more than video. I think it's easier to do, and it's harder to debunk, with the native, there's no native eye sort of recognition, those sort of things. There's less errors. You give more deference to audio. My audio on this right now will sound different than on the phone, but it'll be mostly the same. So your perception it's tougher to parse out what is authentic. I think deep fakes overall are overhyped to a degree, meaning the ones that are really good are extremely costly. And the things that make deepfakes work are more contextual than technical, meaning that if I launch a manipulated video to you when you're under duress or scared, or through social media or times of tension, or when your football game is right at the last minute, right, and I send it out, you're more likely to get duped because there's such a psychological dimension to it that I think we don't entirely understand. I think the last part, and I don't want to go on too long, is that there's so much manipulated video right now that's in television and Hollywood, and you can buy apps on your Instagram that will change things, that people's ideas of what they're acceptable to, what they will accept in terms of max headroom, from when I was a kid. Would I let them read the news? I don't want to get into Ali's field or whatever, but like China has synthetic telecasters right now. Over time, if we get used to digital delivery in all sorts of forms, will we be as concerned about deepfakes, or will we start to change the way we assess information? So I think it's it scares people because it's technology, but I don't know that it is as bad as other things that are out there that we need to worry about.
But Clint, if we could manage that whole issue of assuring people of reliability,
Yes.
then a digital version of me is fine. Even if it looks like me and sounds like me, but isn't actually me, but you can be assured somehow that it's reliable information, then I can be 10 places in once. I can generate more news. It still comes down to that basic challenge of, if you're lying to me, you're lying to me. If I can trust that you're telling me the truth, then the digital part matters less.
Yes.
Can I throw in something that was mentioned earlier, I think by Clint? Is digital watermarking, is blockchain a solution to verified you're listening to who you're listening to, whether it's digital or not?
I will lead it to Maria and Camille. I don't want to take it, but the example I would like is from CNN reporter, a White House press briefing. They speed up the video and manipulate it. That would be great to know what the real video was.
Maria?
I was just going to say, there are two experiments that I was part of. Civil, which was a while ago, to look at crypto to try to deal with this. That didn't succeed, but there's an interesting experiment right now on BitClout. Part of it is because of the cryptocurrency is so sky high, right? But the idea is interesting, and it is direct. It is actually from the audience directly to you. I think the jury is out, but right now it's a completely different system. And again, who's out ahead? The people who want to make money. I think that's part of the problem. You really have to realize that the public sphere is not going to make you that much money protecting the public sphere. And this goes back to like the Consumer Protection Bureau kind of idea to what Ali was saying. You have to protect us from manipulation. That's part of the platform's job, the government's job, the news organization. News groups in general do our jobs.
Camille, you want to jump in on the deepfake conversation?
Yeah, I think I agree with Clint that overall the deepfake sort of scare is overblown. There is, however, one area in which we know it is used, which is to harass women and to over-sexualize women in the context of harassment campaigns. That I think we have to recognize. We have to speak the fact that this is used in this context and not let it be a blind spot. There's two small things that I want to add. The first one is synthetic image is constantly used in social media disinformation campaigns. Fake faces for fake profile, it remains a problem. And I think the frontier here is what I called read face and synthetic text. It's the use of large language models to create batches of posts or text, right? So GPT-3, written articles used in the context of disinformation campaign. So we still have a real set of questions to unpack around synthetic media. They're perhaps not the ones that we thought we were going to have to confront.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. The woman who brought the first case of revenge porn in New York is a friend of mine, and that is a real cyberbullying example problem, and synthetic media there is a huge problem. I'm really glad that you brought that up. Maria, there's a question from the audience that I know that is a pet peeve question for you, which is the difference between misinformation and disinformation. So how do the challenges in addressing misinformation, which is kind of unverified, false, maybe accidentally false, versus disinformation, intentionally misleading information, how are the challenges different?
I think one can, gossip, for example, that gets passed along, the game of telephone. I would call that misinformation. Disinformation is far more manipulative and insidious. It has a goal, and most often it is about power. So it's it's creating narratives and taking away your power in doing that. The disinformation networks are connected. I mean, it's interesting to see that the countries where political disinformation is rampant are oftentimes the same places where anti-vaxxers flourish. There were outbreaks of measles before the coronavirus, before we had to deal with that. So it's we really truly should call disinformation for what it is, because by not doing that, we're we're actually letting people and countries off the hook.
Awesome. I really, really appreciate all of you taking the time to have this important conversation. It's just the beginning. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of nuanced issues to deal with. I sincerely believe we need to get under the hood with science and real evidence and real data. I think we have to stop armchair theorizing about how social media is impacting our societies and really become rigorous about it. I think we need to get transparent. I think we need to have these conversations more and more and more and keep the pressure up, as you all noted. Thank you all for taking the time and for contributing and for being here. Really appreciate it. We're gonna roll out into a break, and we're going to come right back with the next panel, which is about ensuring transparency. So thank you all, and see you soon. Welcome back, everybody. So we had a great first panel talking about how do we rescue truth. And one of the topics that came up during that panel was about transparency. How do we achieve transparency in the social economy, and how critical that is to fixing the social media crises that we find ourselves in. So, a critical step towards any solution here in the social media crisis is this notion of transparency. But nobody's going to forget that the Cambridge Analytica scandal began with Facebook sharing data with an academic institution. Okay, so we're going to get into these topics today. We've got an amazing panel. Carol Cadwalader from The Observer. Gary King had to cancel late last night, so I'm extremely thankful to Nate Persily from Stanford Law School, who is Gary's partner in crime in creating Social Science One, a perfect replacement for Gary today. Really appreciate you, Nate, at the last minute jumping on with us. John Markoff, Pulitzer Prize winner and affiliate fellow, Stanford, and Kate Starbird, professor at University of Washington. We've got a great panel. So let me just briefly sort of set the stage here. In 2018, I gave a interview with Martin Giles of the Tech Review, where I sort of talked about what I called this notion of the transparency paradox. Okay, and the idea of the transparency paradox is that it really sets up our dual problem of our need for platform transparency, algorithmic choice on one hand, being able to know what's going on under the hood of these social platforms on one hand, and on the other hand, our need for privacy and security of our data, right? So at the present, the platforms have and continue to collect unprecedented amounts of personal data, which has a dual value. It has a value to the individual as private data, and it has a value to society in revealing how these platforms are affecting us, how they're working under the hood. So the real question that I want to set up for this panel today is how specifically, in thinking about solutions, which is really the focus of this summit today, how can we achieve the promise of transparency, revealing how these platforms are affecting us and how they work, while also upholding the values of privacy and security? That's sort of really the goal of the heart of the conversation that I want to get to today, and really focusing on what do we do? what are the solutions that we can concretely rely on to achieve this very difficult threading of the needle between transparency on one hand and privacy and security of personal data on the other hand. It's a bit of a technical topic, but honestly, it's absolutely essential to addressing all of the rest of the topics of today, because we got to know what's going on under the hood of these platforms to have any hope of solving the crises that we all have seen unfold over the last many years. So Carol, I want to start with you. You've got a storied career as a groundbreaking journalist. Perhaps most recently and most relevant to this conversation, you were the journalist responsible for breaking the Cambridge Analytica scandal and helping Christopher Wiley in particular tell his story. You know, in a sense, that process of breaking the Cambridge Analytica scandal was a microcosm of this transparency paradox, because the sheer difficulty of making that story public, you know, was about the way that, you know, it was also about the way that Cambridge Analytica got hold of the data, right? Because they got hold of that data through a channel designed to increase Facebook's transparency, right? Facebook shared data with an academic institution for academics to do research about Facebook and how it works under the hood. And that attempt at transparency shuttled unbelievable types of data to a political organization for the purpose of targeting, messaging based on personality types for political consultancy gains to their clients, right? And so it's a microcosm of this problem. So can you reflect on the process for us of breaking the Cambridge Analytica story and how it changed your views about the necessity for transparency in this context? You've talked at length about this in numerous places, but also about the difficulty of achieving transparency when analyzing people's private data is the heart of the transparency itself, right? We want these platforms to be transparent, but in order to do that, we have to analyze private data. So can you reflect on the process of breaking the Cambridge Analytica story and how it changed your views? And then can you reflect on this sort of paradox of achieving transparency by analyzing private data?
Thanks, Sinan. You've set it very well there. But I mean, I think the thing to say really is that the only people and the only entity which has privacy in this entire scenario is the company itself, Facebook. I mean, we certainly don't have privacy because they have got this colossal amount of data on us. But in terms of getting answers from the company, of actually finding out what's going on, we have zero And that is, you know, we are so outgunned, and our ability to get hold of information and to get answers is incredibly limited. And you know, we see this every single day of every single week. I mean, last week I wrote to Facebook's press office asking them about this latest data breach of 533 million people. Facebook's press office didn't even acknowledge my emails now. They didn't even bother to say that they weren't commenting. They just refused even to reply to me. And that's, you know, legitimate journalistic queries around what happened to 533 million people's data. And so, I mean, I think the thing is that we now all take it for read, you know, like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it's such a reference point. But the odds against that coming out were so vanishingly small. And, you know, I think the SEC report is a sort of it certainly made gripping reading for me, because that detailed, you know, how Facebook had actually, and it says it very explicitly, lied to journalists. Through 2017, I and, you know, a couple of other people were repeatedly writing to Facebook to just try and find out what had happened with Cambridge Analytica. And it just shut down our inquiries. And there was, I don't know if you saw, there was a fascinating memo which got leaked a couple of days ago. Facebook's press office accidentally sent an internal memo to a journalist. And it just says, it just has it sort of, well, you know, this is causing a bit of fuss, this latest data breach, but we're really seeing the press interest going down very rapidly. So, you know, we've done a blog post and, you know, we think that should contain it type of thing. So, and it does, that works, you know, and we're now actually, there's sort of diminishing returns because there's so many, you know, there's so many Facebook stories in that way. So it's even harder to break through. So that's what I just really worry about, is the fact that, you know, you can't, you know, how on earth are we going to hold this company to account when we can't even, you know, we can't even get really basic questions answered. And so yes, there is, you know, I think we have very, very little in the way of transparency, and it is a huge problem.
So let me follow up on that. So what do you think, you know, from the perspective of a journalist trying to get answers, trying to get an understanding, trying to get data, what do you think are the points of highest leverage? Is it Freedom of Information Act submissions? Is it public pressure? Do we need more rules and regulations? Like, where's the, where are the points of leverage?
So it's, you know, it's in the absence of you know, legislation that works in that way. The only thing, and that's what Facebook's saying, they literally, their policies depend upon press outrage. That is how they are making their policy decisions around what they are doing with our data. And, you know, I'm fascinated to watch your the upcoming talk with Nick Clegg about this, because, you know, this is you know, there are so many things to worry about that, and you know, because there is, you know, we know that across the world there are these harms in, you know, countries across the world that are sort of like having fallout from you know, Facebook's tools and algorithms, and they have no chance. You know, as I'm a journalist in London, and I can't get, you know, with the shared language and culture and, you know, news organisation, and I can't get my questions answered. You know, I've spoken to journalists from Bangladesh and from India and from Sri Lanka, and, you know, the level of difficulty that they face is, you know, is significantly more. And so, yes, so sorry. I mean, and that's, to be honest with you, in terms of, you know, the thing that I always recognise in terms of the Cambridge Analytica story, the reason why it became a scandal, essentially, is because we had this sort of transatlantic cooperation. And I think it was the fact that the New York Times joined us that that was when it became unignorable. But and, you know, a foreign newspaper in a foreign land is just very, very ignorable, and none of this would have ever come out, I don't think.
So it's, I mean, it sounds like you're saying that public pressure is essential, both journalistic.
Public pressure is absolutely essential. Public pressure is that's literally what Facebook says. Is that they are doing social media monitoring to see what the response is, to see whether they actually, if they actually will provide information or make statements or do anything. That is, and that's an extraordinarily dystopian situation, I think, to be in.
But isn't it also a little bit empowering in the sense that we've got a lot of people watching now? Can't we encourage them? Hey, keep the pressure on. The Delete Facebook movement, the Stop Hate for Profit movement, these things are moving the needle ever so slightly, and we could turn that up. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Although we saw with the Stop Hate for Profit how actually, it was an amazing moment when you had companies like Coca-Cola sort of taking a stand, and yet it didn't have any impact.
Well,
and that's the, I think, the whole reason for everything I'm sort of doing now has come out of the fact that the FTC fined Facebook $5 billion, record amounts, as a result of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and it made no difference. The share price went up. So, what do you do?
Yeah,
that certainly isn't enough.
I think it's absolutely essential to note that the financial impact of a month-long Stop Hate for Profit movement or a $5 billion fine is a drop in the bucket of a growing stock price for sure. But at the same time, Nick Clegg says publicly, look, our advertisers say they don't want X, Y, and Z. They don't want this type of content. They don't want that type of policy. And we have to listen to that. Do you think that's true, or do you think no?
I mean, I think show us the money. But every day, you've got academics here, who've been pointing out these things and shouting about it, and it still goes on. I mean, so I think hollow words really don't mean anything in the context when the harms are so obvious and apparent, and every day brings a fresh sort of a tsunami of sort of global outrages on our shore, doesn't it?
So one final question for you before I move to Nate, which is, we've got this Facebook oversight board, okay? Which, by the way, let's be fair to them for a second, which is to say, I've never seen a private company set up a board where they say we have to abide by their specific content moderation decisions, and this is extra, structural from beyond the side of the company. But at the same time, you've pointed out, and you and others have created the real Facebook oversight board, which is to say, hey, we really want to be really, really independent. So on one hand, I've never seen a company make themselves beholden on content moderation decisions to a board that's not based on its employees. On the other hand, you're saying, hey, it's not independent enough. So what do you think about that?
I just, the point is that if you've got a platform like Facebook, it's their job. It is literally their job. And, outsourcing your most difficult decisions to a body of experts who are, making, what did we hear? Was it something like 60,000 cases they've had directed at them? I think they've picked 12 or so far. I mean, it's ridiculous. And, you go back to public pressure. I did a panel a couple of days ago with a journalist from Brazil. Bolsonaro is right now spreading mis and disinformation about COVID-19 on Facebook's platform. But there's no public outrage in America about that. And so, what's Facebook done? It's done nothing. And that comes back to the only sort of mechanisms I see in terms of accountability is via the US press and hopefully Congress. But, its users in the rest of the world are, have no means at the moment. And it's just incredibly problematic, I think, the oversight board, like billing it as a Supreme Court. Facebook might like to be a country, but it's not actually a country. It doesn't have a constitution. And it just needs to take responsibility for the product that it has created.
So Nate, I want to switch to you. So you and Gary King, with you, Nate, I want to dive right into some of the very specific solution concepts we have seen emerge in terms of really opening up these platforms for scientific study, but then so that scientists can explain to the world what's going on under the hood of these platforms, and also to study the effects that they're having on society. So you and Gary King at Harvard spearheaded the Social Science One initiative, which is this innovative industry academic partnership designed to achieve data transparency between the social platforms and society by making data available to scientists in a safe way so that we can answer questions about, how social media platforms work under the hood, how they're influencing society, and so on. Now, Social Science One went through a lot of ups and downs. For 2 years, Facebook stalled on releasing data. The funders of Social Science One, because no data was being released, threatened to pull out. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that they did pull out, or some of them pulled out. But then Facebook did release a very large tranche of data and used differential privacy to try to thread the needle of the transparency paradox, ensuring privacy while becoming more transparent. So can you describe to us what Social Science One is and what your experience has been in getting data and achieving meaningful platform transparency through this mechanism. I don't know if you're muted. Yeah.
Sorry, you're muted.
Of course, that had to happen. Let me answer that indirectly first, and just amplify something that Carol said, which is that my experience with Social Science One has convinced me that the only way through here is through legislation that forces the large social media and internet platforms to share data in a safe, privacy-protected way with researchers. That nothing else is actually going to solve the what you described as sort of the privacy transparency trade-off, because no matter what. As much public value as we as researchers say there is in the data, folks inside the company naturally are staring down $5 billion fines for privacy abuses and the like. And so unless there's some other legal equity that forces them to share the data, that there's no way that we're going to get through that. For those who are interested, I'm writing a piece of legislation on this. I've summarized at the top of my Twitter feed personally. Now to your question. So how did I arrive at that decision or that conclusion? And the answer is that we started up Social Science One with the goal of finding what was an authentically independent pathway for researchers to gain access, so that Facebook would have no say over which researchers had access to the data and the like. But as you sort of hinted, it's not as if Facebook can just dump all of its data onto the research community. You need to figure out which data and under what circumstances and the like. And so within months of the creation of Social Science One, there were privacy concerns that were raised by the Electronic Privacy Information Center, writing letters against Social Science One in European Commission and the FTC, saying basically that any sharing of data with researchers was potentially a privacy violation. In those succeeding 2 years, then we moved from what I thought was going to be a kind of safe research environment in which you would have regulated, sort of observed individuals getting access to Facebook data, to one, as you said, where the data itself was then massaged and differential privacy was added. And the data that was released was at the URL level, meaning that they released millions of URLs with certain data that is associated with them, so that people could do some kinds of research on the most popular URLs, or what types of URLs were gaining traction, who was seeing them, and the like. But this is a very large data set, it's a very complicated data set, and because of the way that it's released, it doesn't answer some of the most pressing questions that we really need to answer. In the last year, Facebook has worked with researchers to study the impact of Facebook on the 2020 election, and those researchers will come up with some conclusions over, I think, the summer. But the goal of Social Science One, as you said, was to try to make the data available to the larger research community. And I think that that has proven to be extremely hard because of this privacy transparency trade-off that you were describing.
So, let's define a few terms here, and I want to get into a little bit of the nuance about the types of research that can be done.
Yeah.
So just for a general audience, let's just say that differential privacy is a way to add noise to individual level data in order to try and preserve their privacy while being able to study individual level data with some noise, preserving privacy. You're right. It necessarily makes some research questions harder to answer. Another thing I want to point out is that if you want to study, for example, like I do, the effect of social media platforms on democracy, on elections in particular, you need some sort of causal inference. You need to know what the causal effect of social media is on behaviors, decisions, voting, opinions, and so on. So running experiments like the way these platforms do every day, thousands of experiments to figure out how to better improve their profits, running those types of experiments to see how does it affect elections, how does it affect bias, how does it affect cyberbullying, how does it affect misinformation, and so on is important. So my question is, what can we do to get better at making these platforms more secure and more transparent at the same time through differential privacy? How can we get access to being able to run experiments inside these platforms to know how they cause the effects that we are seeing in society so that we can come up with solutions? Are there approaches to this? I know you've written a white paper called Opening a Window into Tech, the Challenge and Opportunity for Data Transparency. So maybe you could tackle that question for us.
So there's two sets of questions there. One, which is about just data access, and then the other on experiments. Let me just say that if we had an open platform where academics were going in and running experiments during elections, I can tell you Carol Cadwalader is going to be writing a lot of articles about that. And so if you're worried about Cambridge Analytica, imagine if you open that Pandora's box. But nevertheless, I agree with you that that's kind of what we really need in terms of understanding the impact of Facebook and the like. What was your first question?
Question is, how do we do it? How do we make
I mean, there are three elements to any regulatory regime in order to deal with this. The first is you have to grant immunity to the platforms when they do share data under prescribed circumstances, right? It's not like you just give them immunity for something like Cambridge Analytica, but the point is if we spell out what a researcher safe harbor looks like, and under certain conditions, monitored conditions, kind of like what we would do with sensitive either defense data or IRS data or biomedical data or census data, then they will not incur liability merely from the giving of access to researchers. Second, for researchers that scrape these platforms, the public data, they also need immunity. And so there's a lot of stuff that we can do on the outside. And whether it's Aaron Swartz or others, there's real fear of civil and criminal liability. There needs to be legislation to immunize them. And then we need to force Facebook and Google, and we haven't talked about Google at all here, but the amount of the lack of research on YouTube is like a critical void in the research community. We need to compel them to share their data under prescribed circumstances. Now, the shadow of Cambridge Analytica is cast over all of this, and we need to recognize that. And so but there are ways of avoiding that, and there are ways of having criminal liability for researchers if they misuse the data. But we can have safe, privacy-protected ways that researchers, under penalty of under criminal penalty, could have access to some of this data and then find out some of the answers to these questions.
Thank you. That's awesome. I mean, platform immunity, researcher immunity, broadly speaking, completely agree with you with the black box of YouTube and research dearth on YouTube, which is such an important channel. And this notion that we have to have real legislation with teeth to compel social media platforms to share data, that otherwise the incentive structures just don't match up with them actually doing it enough to achieve meaningful transparency. Yeah.
Let me just say one other thing, which is that Europe will lead the way here. So there will be action in the next, and this is one of the things through Social Science One that I think we've helped to open up, which is that Brussels, I think, will be the first mover here, as they are in so many things when it comes to tech regulation. And so there's a working group. Rebecca Tromble at GW is part of this that's working on that. And I think you'll see some. Let me just say about Social Science One generally, that I've often described Social Science One as like roadkill on the highway to something beautiful, right? Which is that we needed to do some of the things that we did in order to figure out some of these problems, to have the privacy communities say what they did. If you look at the website, you will see the research data agreement, which spent about 8 months trying to negotiate with Facebook, with universities. You need these kinds of legal moves in order to have some kind of infrastructure for data access.
Awesome, thanks. John, I wanna switch to you. So you've been a leading technology journalist for a long time, author for many years. Many look to you to help us understand the role of journalism specifically in achieving transparency in technology industries. And as we know, there are both good and bad stories in these industries, not limited to data. So what are journalists' roles in this process? What are the platform's responsibilities to journalists, piggybacking on what Carol opened up earlier, when it comes to transparency?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about this period is how dramatically journalism has changed in the face of this social media. And so we're entering a period, I mean, actually, I thought we would go through a period where these new models of journalism would emerge. We'd shift from print journalism to interactive journalism, and we'd be in this new world. And what I realized, I think even a decade ago, is this going to be this period of, in terms of the nature of journalism, it's just period of permanent chaos. And we're still there. I thought as print journalists were cast aside, there would be new jobs for interactive journalists, online journalists. And the numbers still, I think, don't, there is not the economic basis for a sustained journalistic community to do the kinds of things that Carol talked about. It's still going in the wrong direction. And I worry particularly that we're at this inflection point. Until now, we've largely been in a world where human actors have interacted on these platforms. And the inflection point is we're at a point where increasingly most of our interactions, and this, I'm adding journalism into this, and media and news media, most of the interactions that humans are having are actually with machines and with bots and with AIs. And I think this is a particularly interesting point in time because yesterday the European Union issued a set of proposed regulations that are intended to limit the function and regulate the function of artificial intelligences. And I think it's going to be a long process. It's not clear. I mean, I've read the news reports. I haven't actually read the proposed regulations, but I think that is in some ways a more important thing now than GDPR has been in the past, and in particularly the way the technology is going and the way these platforms are evolving.
Yeah, I mean, as I said in the opening of this summit, we're really at a crossroads today. So many governments are looking at what to do. Here in the U.S. last week, the FTC just said that they're going to step in terms of algorithmic bias. We're seeing lots of different types of motion. On journalists, do journalists have to become data scientists now? Is that sort of a part of the job now?
Well, absolutely. However, Carol's point that Facebook has not even deigned to respond anymore suggests to me that old school journalism is actually even more important now than it was before. There's been this tremendous emergence of data journalism. It's a great thing, but when they don't open the front door, you have to go in the back door. And building up sources, talking to employees who may not be on board with the management of the corporations is increasingly important. I was probably one of the first journalists to use electronic mail as a way of getting to sources. We're talking now the 1980s. This is deep, dark history. And it was wonderful because you'd have the PR people as gatekeepers and you could go around them and directly contact journalists. But there was a certain point when it became, it was a competitive advantage for a while. And then toward the end of my career, I went back to using the telephone because it was old school and often it was more effective to talk to people, not face to face, but voice to voice. And so I think that traditional journalism, the value of traditional journalism is even more important today than it was perhaps a decade ago.
So Carol and Nate, had a minute to talk about, what they think we need to concretely do as a solution to open up this transparency. Nate stating that we absolutely need legislation that compels the platforms to share data. What do you think we can concretely do to improve the relationship between these platforms and journalists in a way that addresses the transparency paradox of people keeping people's private data private and achieving transparency?
Well, so for me, I agree with both of them. The only real solutions are legislative. The notions that corporations can self-police, we've given them 2 decades. Here we are. I mean, I covered computer security going all the way back. And what was striking to me for the last decade that I did this is every year RSA Data Security, the industry conference on security, would get bigger. It became massive, and yet each year computer security became worse. And I think in the same way we're faced with the same situation of things you're talking about.
So Kate, I want to bring you into this. So you're a leading researcher on social platforms, especially when it comes to studying misinformation, studying information diffusion during crisis events like natural disasters, but also social and political crises. So as a scientist, if you could wave a magic wand and get the access you truly need to best inform the public about how social platforms are impacting society, affecting us, what types of data would you need access to most that you can't currently get?
Okay, let me speak from my perspective as a scientist. I use mixed methods more than experimental methods, and so I'll probably speak a little bit more to that. But I understand that there's other folks that use other approaches. And I think for this question, I mean, you've brought it up. The privacy paradox actually shapes a lot of that. So I'm going to pretend that's not there for now, and we can come back to what to do when we understand it's there. So we've done a lot of picking on Twitter as academics. If you look through the papers of the conferences that I've gone to for the last 10 or so years, you'll see tons and tons of studies on Twitter because that data has been public. You'll see far less on Facebook, YouTube, and some of these other platforms. And so if I think about what we'd really need from those platforms to understand the kind of phenomena we've been able to reveal on Twitter, but we haven't been able to kind of unpack on these other platforms. So starting with Facebook, they put out the CrowdTangle tool now. Many of us have access to that, so we can see public groups and public pages. But that's clearly not enough. We need more insight into private groups. We need insight and more visibility into how information jumps from groups to private feeds and moves through shares and reshares to kind of understand how that sort of organic sharing process takes content to the masses. We need a better understanding of what individuals see on the platforms and how they come to see that via sort of recommendations, algorithmic feeds, network connections, and those kinds of things. So there's just a ton of Facebook that's just not visible to us as researchers. I love the fact that Nate brought up YouTube. I think that YouTube is horribly understudied, in part because it's so hard to get access to the data. And so half the research study is to try to devise the methods to get the data that you need. So we need better APIs and generally just better access to YouTube. Currently, when we report on YouTube, it's because we've found evidence of YouTube videos being really prominent and influential on other platforms. But it would be good to be able to search YouTube directly without running into rate limits straight away, and to have better transparency of their recommendations and algorithms. And beyond that, we have tons and tons of other platforms, up and coming things like TikTok and others, and peer-to-peer sharing like Telegram, where we know a lot of misinformation is spreading, and we have really very little visibility into what's happening there. So in general, more visibility into what users see and where they see it and why they see it, more transparency into the policies and how they're enforced. And I do think repositories, one thing that we encountered when we started the 2020 election was a lot of the content that we realized at a certain point was really valuable had disappeared because it had been moderated and taken down. And so on Twitter, we're catching content in real time, so we can go back and see that. On Facebook, once it's been taken down or suspended, we can no longer see the record of that. So having the companies keep repositories of what content's been taken down for suspensions or other reasons, I think would be really valuable in understanding sort of the malicious use of those platforms.
So I'm going to put some of these questions directly to Nick Clegg in the Fireside chat at lunch, specifically about algorithmic transparency. So stay tuned for that. But I wanted to ask you another question, because you just said we need access to your private groups. And when the audience hears that, I'm sure many of them legitimately cringe and say, wait a minute, you want to study what I'm saying in my private groups? So how do we think about balancing society's right to know with individuals' right to privacy? Do we have tools that allow us to thread this needle well?
I think that's where it becomes more important to see sort of the patterns of things moving and where we can add layers of privacy to kind of hide the identity of individuals that were participating in those groups, and even potentially the names of the individual groups, unless they're revealed in other ways. I imagine once you know things are flowing, you can unwind which groups they came from through other trace data that we would have. But I think it's more important to see the larger scale patterns in how those groups are influential in sort of mass manipulation or spreading malicious content into other parts of the ecosystem. And that's the thing, is we have this ecosystem that's so connected within platform, across platform. And if we've got one little section that's invisible, that's doing a lot of the manipulation, it's sometimes hard to unwind it. So just to be able to isolate and say, okay, this is the effect of what those private groups are having, without necessarily knowing who within them and which individual groups. But certainly, yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done on the layers of privacy side. And this from a researcher who participated in Social Science 1 and knows exactly how hard it was to answer some of our questions once those layers of privacy have been added.
Carol, it seemed like you wanted to get in on that.
Mute. So yes, well, it's, you know, I just got very excited about the fact that you've got Nick Clegg up next, and I was, there was a couple of things basically, which was bouncing off what Kate said about, but Mark Zuckerberg refused to come to Britain to give evidence to our parliaments. And now this is Nick Clegg. He's our deputy prime minister. He served in that parliament for many, many years. How is that? You know, how does he defend that? I mean, that his boss showed himself to be completely impervious to our national legislature. And then my second question for Nick Clegg is that he was a passionate pro-European. And the one thing we do know is that that referendum was won and lost on Facebook's platform. And we know that these laws were broken. So, you know, that bad actors exploited that platform. But Facebook has always just refused to hand, this is the thing about what Kate was saying, when it's gone, it's gone. And when it's gone, it's gone. Our entire election, which has changed the constitution of Great Britain forever, is lost on that platform. And Facebook has refused to hand over any of the evidence. And yeah, I just like, you know, I just wonder, you know, how, I would just like some answers on that. And I'm not allowed to ask that question because he certainly won't take any questions from me, or in fact, any of my colleagues at the Guardian and Observer. So if you could bung them over for us, Sinan, I'd be grateful. Thanks.
So I want to follow up on something you just said, which is you said that the Brexit referendum was won and lost on Facebook. And as somebody that researches this specifically, and having looked at all the evidence that we have available to us, I don't think we have the transparency currently to know whether that's true or not. So in a sense, I'm sort of
well, we can
a question behind the question, right?
Yeah. So I guess the point is that because in Britain we've actually got these sort of tight spending laws, so we know how much money can be spent in the election. It's not a huge amount of money, and it was the vast majority of it was spent on Facebook. And extra illegal money was funneled onto Facebook, which Facebook, you know, that its machinery enabled those bad actors to break the law. So yes, you're right. We can't. The whole point is that we can't look at that in any detail because we don't have the evidence. But all of the surrounding evidence, which is, as I say, we know it was fought on there. But yeah, who was targeted, how they were targeted, what they were targeted with, what they were seeing. The lies that they were told, that we don't have access to.
We don't know. Yeah. Kate, it looked like you wanted to jump in on that.
I mean, I'm just thinking of other examples where, you know, not even in the election context, but we have evidence in our lives that people are going down the rabbit hole left and right. And very little, and we know, the stories, and okay, and people would come up after me back when we had an in-person world after my talks, and they would say, oh, my loved one, you know, and this was their story, and YouTube and all these things. And so we have we have this very anecdotal evidence, but it's really hard to put it together and make those quantitative claims because we just don't have enough access to the quantitative data to measure the impact that we have very strong hypotheses that the impact is there and very difficult to measure.
Could I actually jump in on that also, which is that so just to put a pin in it, right? There are elements of conventional wisdom that everyone takes as granted that we don't know the answer to. First is, does YouTube's recommendation algorithm actually send people toward more extreme, extremist groups and sites? Secondly, the prevalence of hate speech and disinformation, where everybody thinks that it's running, rampant on Facebook and YouTube and like. The only people who really know that are inside the companies. And the third is something that Carol was just mentioning, which is the effectiveness of political advertising or advertising generally, and how it affects people's opinions. The people inside, there are people inside Facebook who know the answers to these questions. And, we can get glimpses on the outside, and for the most part, social scientists are telling complicated stories about those things. But, we could have a Manhattan Project that answers those questions, and we can devise a research design that would figure this out. But we need to do it soon, right? Because part of it, what worries me is that policymakers are making policy in the dark, right? So that if you do not have informed research that can educate people who are about to, have regulation, say, of content on Facebook and other platforms, then, you don't know whether you're going to solve the problem or make it worse.
I mean, Nate, count me in, please. For years, I have been trying to, as loudly as I possibly can, bullhorn this message out into the public sphere. We really don't know. I will say, we know a little bit, right? I mean, if you look at sort of like Brockman and Kalla and others, the research that's been done, it seems like political advertising doesn't have much of an effect on political opinions, like which way you're going to vote, but that it's the opposite for get out the vote. In other words, that it does have an effect on who votes. And by the way, we all know Facebook did an experiment. 61 million people, 2010 midterm election in the US, directly moved 300,000 votes, which is more than what was the difference in the 2016 election, indirectly moved 800,000 people to vote. Those are big numbers, right? So it seems like in terms of getting out the vote and getting people voting, it does seem to have a causal positive effect with one single, tweak to the algorithm. But in terms of actually changing the way people vote, it looks over and over again like there's zero effect on that. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot to say about all of those things. And part of the question, one of the big questions is how different is the online environment from the legacy media environment, right? So that there's been a huge debate for years about the impact of political advertising on television and whether it makes a difference. Now, look, in a low information race where the only information you get is from advertising of whatever form, of course, it's going to have a bigger difference than it would be in, a presidential race where you're going to get, all kinds of information from so many sources. Look, I cut my teeth on the voter turnout literature a long time ago in graduate school. We've probably studied that more than almost any other issue. But the question, right, apropos of what Carol was saying, what we worry about most, right, is massive amounts of spending from the candidates, campaigns, and interest groups, and how that might either shift the composition of the electorate through voter turnout or alienation, right? Or how it converts people in their political preferences. And we only, sort of have the nuggets of information about how that might have happened in 2016 and 2020. 2016, right? The narrative is that $100,000 of Russian political ads on Facebook that mostly dealt with issues somehow had this massive effect on the ecosystem, right? I think we all agree that whatever effect something like that is happening in paid communication, the organic content, which is really much more overwhelming, is going to have a bigger impact, right? Because you're just getting so much more of it. And I do think that, Facebook, if it eliminated political ads tomorrow, it probably would not have much of an effect on something like a presidential election where the money will just flow into other vectors. But again, it's not just presidential elections where these things matter, whether it's referenda or whether it's local and congressional elections, it could make a difference.
So I want to bring our audience, John, go ahead.
Well, I worry about fighting the last war a lot in this context. Yeah. I wanted to ask the data scientists where we are on fake accounts. The last thing I've seen is Sophie Zong's memo at the end of last year, which suggested to me that fake accounts are still a huge problem. And I worry about in the context of other than human beings behind those accounts in the future?
Kate?
Yeah, so my understanding, and this is a moving target, based on, papers that are, coming through, being published and reviewed, are that when we think, the fake accounts are still present. They're still present in high numbers. But my understanding is that they don't actually have a lot of effect on individuals that follow them or see their content. Their main purpose is to manipulate the algorithms, to try to like grow the followers of another account, or to, bump something up in the recommendations by like suddenly liking a bunch of things. And so it gets bumped in the recommendations. So that mostly we're seeing fake accounts used to manipulate algorithms and not directly influence individuals. So you're more likely to see the content they're amplifying than you are to see the content that they're sharing directly. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. What I worry about is what happens when the progress that's been made in language models is significant. And what happens when you put language models that are intended to interact with human beings behind these things? That's the next war as far as I can see.
Yeah, I'm worried about that as well, having studied just copied and pasted content, not even in social media, but across websites, and how effective that was at getting people this false sense of triangulation. And that was when it was almost exactly the same content. And so now we'll have the ability to sort of astroturf slightly different content, which is really going to both disrupt our our psychological mechanisms of dealing with this content. We won't be able to see that it's not the same person. We'll think it's different voices, and certainly it'll make it harder for the detection of those things unless somehow the arms race of detection with these models can keep up with the models themselves.
So I want to bring our audience in and take some questions for the audience. So broadly, anybody can jump in. What does the panel think about legislation to mandate the public release of all advertising data, including the targeting parameters as proposed in Europe, and in a more limited form in the US in the Honest Ads Act?
So I can jump in here if you want. So I'm in favor of it, except there are some privacy implications in doing that. And so this actually goes back to your discussion of differential privacy, which I kind of glossed over. But part of the problem here is if you know what the targeting criteria are in an ad and you know who received the ad, you can start knowing something about the people who received the ad, right? So if you know that you're targeting people who are cancer survivors or something like this, and then you find out somebody who had the ad, then you know something about that person, right? And so there are ways to deal with that problem, right? And it's one of the many data issues that you can solve. And Google and Facebook have taken different approaches in their ad libraries as to how they deal with targeting versus exposure. But clearly we need to have better data on both of those factors.
Oh, don't get me started on targeting and exposure data. Another question from the audience. How do we ensure the transparency of the social platform's own experiments on users? The emotional contagion experiment as a specific example, we're talking about researchers doing experiments in safe harbor and regulated ways. What about all those other experiments? How do we ensure transparency there? And who wants to jump in there?
I could go again, but does someone else want to?
I'll just go quickly and sort of strengthen that question a little bit, or even just affirm it. Every time I hear the research community arguing about the need to do more experiments, I think back to running these debates in my classroom for the last 10 years or whatever, since the emotional contagion experiment, about how just the ethical fraughtness of that and how people perceive it, and certainly how, the issues of consent and whether or not people are consenting to these things. And I know Facebook tried to do something different with that this year, where people actually consented to be part of these studies. But I do think there's some need for a framework around how those experiments should work, whether academics are doing them or the companies are doing them themselves.
So a question for Carol and John. Does it make sense to explicitly create teams of journalists and data scientists working together now?
Carol.
Basically, I think the sort of the old models of journalism don't work in so many ways. So I sort of, I think just more collaboration, more across news organizations, across disciplines is kind of absolutely fundamental. And because, the thing that, we see is just that Facebook plays journalists off against each other all the time. It plays off one outlet against another. It plays favorites. And so, I really feel that the sort of like we have to adapt to that. And that there is, we need to create new models where there is sort of, there's solidarity and strength essentially in terms of, demanding answers and all the rest of it. And I think the idea of sort of cross-disciplinary approaches is another part of that, and would be, brilliant to see. I mean, some of it does already happen, but just generally with everything to do with journalism, we need more of it. We need more resource, we need more journalists, we need more money. We need the platforms to, stop destroying our business models.
John?
Just to say that large journalistic organizations like New York Times, that's been the model for a number of years. It just is the way it works. And I'd just like to briefly jump back with respect to the last question. I mean, next week, I believe Apple's going to run this fascinating experiment of giving people control over what they want to share for the first time. And I don't know if researchers will get access to that information, but I think it's the first time that we're going to see what consumers actually feel about the practices in the industry in sort of a real world kind of way.
So I'm going to direct a question to Kate, but I'm actually going to take the liberty of trying to answer one of these questions that's coming from the audience a little bit as well. The question is, what about when academic research is funded by the platforms? How transparent and objective is that? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge emoji, wink emoji, wink emoji, which, by the way, I'm getting these questions in my chat feed. I don't have to ask them. And that's why I'm asking it, because it's a critical question for academics that they need to answer. Totally agree. 100%. I prefer to collaborate with platforms where we get data access, but the funding is not from the platform itself. And I have very strict personal standards for how I deal with navigating the setup and execution and reporting of a certain study. Certainly set up all of those frameworks in the conversation in advance before doing any of the research. We have data use contracts that have been well designed at MIT that ensure our ability to publish, that ensure our ability to say what the result is, regardless of what the result is. We have honed those over many years in order to maintain objectivity, in order to maintain our ability to say what the answers are, and so on. And I have had some issues. So I have had to fight actual legal battles. I've had to spend hours in meetings with lawyers around those types of exact questions. And in each of those scenarios, and thankfully, I just want to give a big shout out to MIT, stuck to our guns, and MIT as an institution brought the full weight of their influence into the conversation to stand up for the science and for the objectivity of the scientists trying to publish the results of studies. Kate, I wonder what your experience has been.
We spend hours, and we have a new center at the University of Washington, hours and hours talking about this challenge, both on the funding side and the data access side, because both are ways that a platform can exert control over researchers, as well as just the perception of compromise, which I think is almost just as important when you're studying disinformation. And so we've been very, very reluctant to take any money from any of the platforms that we're studying. And at the same time, we're in a world where, maybe not this year, but other years, the government funding of science is shrinking. The platforms have more and more money and in many ways, we're serving a service to them because we're helping them figure out what's going on in their platforms. And at the same time, we really can't take money from them. So that was one of the things I thought was really important about Social Science 1, is it gave distance between the funding and the data access, between the platforms and the researchers on both of those dimensions. And I think it's really important that researchers don't don't have to rely on personal relationships with people at the platforms for either asking for funding or for asking for data.
And that's right. We tried, we had this coalition of about 10 funders on the outside. And thank you for saying that, Kate. But Sinan, you sort of talked about the difficulties, with the funders too, right? Which is that, they get frustrated with Facebook. They get, you have to be in there for the long haul. It's very difficult. We at the Stanford Cyber Policy Center don't take money from the big platforms, and I've stayed away from anything with getting money from Facebook or Google and the like. Especially at Stanford, we got to, we're in the belly of the beast here, so we got to be really careful about that. But I wonder whether there is a way through where we could have a fund that they contribute to that they then have no connection, that they will have no control over the research, right? So if each one of the big platforms gave $10 to $20 million or more and put it into a separate fund that they then have no control over, would there be, and then it's administered by the National Academy of Science, you figure out some way of having real independence for social media research, that might fill some of the gaps that Kate's talking about with government funding and the like. People will still pursue, you got to figure out a way to have general authentic independence, but it's really, really difficult.
Nate, I big kudos to you for the proposal you just proposed about a fund that they contribute to. One gripe, I think the numbers are a little low there. I think $50 to $100 million.
As long as we're doing that, let's say $500 million. I mean, look, they find it in the couch cushions at these platforms anyway. So it's like, as long as we're talking, what's a few $100 million between friends here? But yeah, sure, that's fine.
I mean, I really, in all seriousness and tongue in cheek and so on, it is small numbers for them, but we need this money in order to be able to do the research that's going to help us fix the social media crises that we find ourselves in, that's going to help us make all of this more transparent. So I want to bring this to a close. We've come to 11:45 on the East Coast. I just want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in this incredibly important conversation. Carol, in a completely different time zone, it's getting late over there for you. Thank you for sticking around. Kate and Nate on the West Coast, getting up early to have this conversation with us. We really, really appreciate all of you, and also to the audience for submitting such great questions. We're going to roll into a break here. And then we're going to come back for the fireside conversation between me and Nick Clegg at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We will see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Welcome back, everybody. It's been a really, really fantastic morning. A lot of really in-depth conversations with some incredibly dedicated and smart people talking about issues that are tremendously important to our democracies, our economies, our public health. So at lunch today, we've got a really important conversation with Nick Clegg, Global Head of PR for Facebook. We want to ask him some tough questions. We also want to be fair to him, and we want to allow him to really express himself as best we can. So, Nick, it's really great to have you. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're extremely busy, but to participate in conversations like this, it's such an important part of your job, of Facebook's responsibility. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with us.
No, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So let me start with a bit of a mission that you've been on lately. You've been talking a lot about what seems like a quest to defend the free internet, if you will. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Defriend is quite interesting.
Defend.
It's quite an interesting Facebook slip of the tongue.
Yeah.
Look, let me try and sort of frame this a bit as we sort of kick off this conversation. I think we're finally getting beyond this rather stale debate about whether there should be new rules of the road for the internet, whether there should be new regulation for companies like Facebook. Of course there should be. I mean, it's just obvious. You know, the last time there was sort of proper internet regulation in the US, for instance, was 25 years ago. The world's completely changed since then. So I think that, you know, that debate's done. We're going to get new regulation. We need new regulation. There need to be new rules of the road. I think now the debate is a much more, in a sense, more interesting one, which is, how do we regulate at national level without balkanizing the global internet? In other words, can we regulate without, in a sense, destroying what is open and free about the global internet? I think it's a much more perilous exercise than many people are assuming, partly because we're stuck still in this kind of old stone throwing debate about, oh, you know, these companies are too powerful, they should be regulated. Yes, of course they should be. I mean, you know, we're done with that. The legislators in the UK, the EU, India, here in the US, everybody's now moving beyond shouting at the problem to actually rolling up their sleeves and doing something about it. So the next question is, what happens when lots of different jurisdictions impose national regulation? What effect does that have on the seamless open internet? And of course, this is all happening when social media in particular, and the internet generally, is in a sense the sort of technological epitome of globalization, the free flow of data, of voices, of expression, and so on, regardless of borders, at a time, which we're now living through, of political deglobalization. I mean, if you look at, you know, Brexit in my country, economic nationalism in India, the nativism of politics in large parts of Europe, the polarization in the US, you know, since the high point of sort of political openness in 1989, we've been moving progressively towards a more kind of deglobalized politics, where politicians want to kind of control things which they feel they haven't been able to control hitherto. And all of that is happening at a time when, of course, we on calls like this may think that we know what we're talking about when we say the internet. But of course, for lots of people in the world, there's a completely different model of the internet which they're operating in. And it's a highly successful one. It's a Chinese paradigm of the internet, which has spawned, you know, world-beating companies. There's a level of digitalization of everyday life in China which is far in excess of what it is. If you just look at payments, for instance, far in excess of what it here is in the United States. They're making massive advances on AI and so on. And if you are, but they have none of the sort of, you know, they have none of the angst that we rightly do about privacy, data protection, data use, and so on. And if you are a authoritarian or semi-authoritarian leader in Russia, Turkey, Thailand, Vietnam, you kind of increasingly think, oh, well, maybe the Chinese model of the internet suits my needs better than the one which is, in a sense, promulgated by Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, which is the reason why I spend a huge amount of my time in my role leading the policy teams in Facebook, you know, constantly navigating these difficult debates we have with decision makers there who want to suppress and censor more and more speech. And all of this has happened while the EU and the US, who you logically would have thought should be the real engine for new ideas about the governance of the global internet. I mean, the Atlantic has just got a whole lot wider in recent years. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Partly the Trump administration wasn't really interested in working with the Europeans. The EU is going through a slightly sort of defensive crouch at the moment for a whole bunch of wider reasons. The US anyway, strategically, was pivoting more to the Pacific, even under Obama than it was to the Atlantic. And so I think, just at the time when you need joint American-European leadership on these ideas, it's been lacking. And so my hope is that the three sort of following things happen as we develop this debate and try and square this circle of how to regulate without, in a sense, balkanizing or undermining the openness of a global internet. I think you need three things. Firstly, the EU and the US, really need to try and kind of get their act together. And I think, the Biden administration, thankfully, is making real overtures to the EU to try and find common cause on some of the new regulatory ideas that the EU have put forward. Secondly, as soon as possible, I think the EU and the US need to try and bring India into their thinking, because if you can have, I think the future of the internet is basically going to be decided, certainly in terms of governance, in India. If India goes, how can I put this to simplify things grotesquely, if India goes in a sort of Chinese direction of heavier surveillance, of kind of trying to build walls around their internet, then I think the fragmentation of the so-called splinternet will accelerate dramatically. But if India can work cooperatively with the EU and the US to set new global rules, that would be great. And then the final thing I'd say is we need institutions. We just don't have institutions where these discussions can take place. We have certain institutions for certain topics. So the OECD is dealing with tax. I hope they come up with a solution. We need new tax rules which can be multilaterally applied to big digital companies and others. You have standard setting bodies. But what you don't have is a forum where a lot of the key countries in the world can get together. And I saw recently, actually, Facebook was not a signatory, but there was I think about last month, there was a letter published by 25 companies from, I think, both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere, advocating, I think, what they called a data and technology forum to be established by the G7. And I think that's, I think that's the kind of thing we really, really need, because I certainly know from my 20 years in politics, if you don't have the places where decision makers can sit and thrash these things out, nothing happens. And I think we have a lack of institutional architecture at the moment. So those are the kind of things which I think we should be focusing on, amongst many other things, no doubt.
Thanks. There's a ton of meat in there, and we're going to get into a lot of those conversations about geopolitics, the splinternet, balkanization, et cetera. By the way, in my book, I call for a national commission on democracy and technology here in the United States, because I think that there's a lot of balkanization going on even within this country about how we can get into it. But we just had a panel on transparency, which was all about, the differences between Europe and the United States about getting access to data and how to manage the relationship between privacy on one hand and transparency on the other. But you said, we understand regulation has to happen. Now it's about having meaningful conversations about exactly what that regulation is. So what's Facebook's position on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act? Repeal, reform, and if reform, what are the specific reforms you think will work best to balance, the need for platforms having a skin in the content moderation game, but also keeping the internet workable?
Yeah, reform rather than repeal, for sure. I think in two areas. Well, firstly, I should say, just on the politics of this, the easiest thing to find in Washington at the moment is people from both sides of the aisle saying, we need to change to Section 230. The hardest thing to find is actually substantively, where do they agree on how to do that? So again, I think we've got to get beyond the kind of debate about does it need to be reformed, because everybody kind of agrees. The problem is, as you know, in DC, Republicans and Democrats are coming at this from almost polar opposite directions. So the Democrats feel that platforms like Facebook aren't taking enough content down, or should be taking more content down. And the Republicans feel that there is sort of private sector censorship of political views going on, and that too much content is being taken down. So I think there's quite a narrow landing strip where you can get both Democrats and Republicans to work together on this. But I hope they will be able to. And I would suggest two ideas. Firstly, I think it's pretty obvious that the systems that private companies like Facebook use, and we have, the company is very proud of these very sophisticated community standards we promulgate. We have huge teams of people, 35,000 people working on how to kind of moderate content. We've develop new independent institutions like the oversight board to act as a sort of final mechanism of appeal for content decisions. We use AI at huge scale to remove content, to block fake accounts and so on and so forth. But I think it's right, and maybe this could happen through the reform of Section 230, to hold companies like Facebook more stringently to account, so that we publish oodles of data every, I think, 12 weeks now, but it's our data. And quite rightly, people say, well, hang on, you're sort of judge and jury of your own data. How can we believe it? And we're trying to take initiatives to address that ourselves by subjecting our data transparency reports, which set out everything we do on hate speech, on violence, on terrorism, and so on. We're going to subject that to an independent audit. But I do think it would be a good thing for a government-sponsored form of audit of and basic standards of accountability and transparency to be by statute enforced upon companies. And the second area is this: illegal content. Everybody agrees that illegal content should be, obviously, it's illegal. It should be removed, and companies like Facebook are under, quite rightly, strict legal obligation to do so. I think how you administer that, though, through Section 230, if you do it if you only pursue every bit of content that has escaped through the net, and because no system is perfect, so there will always be a piece of content or a post that should have been caught that hasn't been. I think you'll just endlessly be playing sort of whack-a-mole. But instead, if you say to companies in Silicon Valley, look, you have an obligation and you have no immunity on, for instance, really, really egregious data. Let's say content on child sexual exploitation. But if you can prove through your systems that you have done everything that can be reasonably expected of you to bear down on that illegal content, then you can, in a sense, earn immunity. So a sort of a process of earned immunity. And I think why that might work is it would put huge pressure on the Silicon Valley companies to get their systems absolutely as effective, as well-resourced, and as transparently sort of effective as they possibly could be. So I think a process of, it's what I call sort of earned immunity rather than assumed or granted immunity without any conditionality. So conditional immunity from liability might be a way forward, particularly for illegal content.
So I actually really like this idea of earned immunity. So in terms of the civil liability shield, you earn protections from civil liability by demonstrating goodwill and demonstrable full force efforts to deal with the issues of harmful versus free speech online that we've been talking about. So we're going to talk a lot about transparency and how do we vet that you've earned that immunity, for example. So should we just leave that up to Facebook and the rest of the platforms in terms of demonstrating earned immunity, or
no,
what's the independent verification process?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely not. You shouldn't allow the companies to be sort of judge and jury of their own. They shouldn't mark their own homework. No, I think. But look, all of this obviously is open for debate, and it's not. It's for legislators to write the law, not for us. We're just grappling with this ourselves, and so these are just some of ideas that we've generated within Facebook. But I do think you'd need a statutorily established body, a sort of regulatory third-party body that would vet whether the companies that subject to a reformed Section 230 do have the systems in place and have done everything that can reasonably be asked of them to develop those systems, to resource them, and to properly and to implement them fully. So I know absolutely. So you would definitely need to create some new institutional architecture which would vet whether the companies are in a position to earn, or indeed the reverse, whether they fail to do so, and whether sanctions should be applied, and whether the earned liability should be withdrawn from them, because it should always be conditional, of course, on ongoing good practice.
Yeah, in thinking about this, it's easy to ask the question and it's easy to put it to you. But if somebody were to ask the question to me, I would then have to fumble and stumble a little bit because, for instance, a lot of the institutions that you would look to be the vetters of something like that are politicized. So if you look to, for instance, the FTC or the FCC, these are 5-person politically appointed commissions. So we need some sort of more objective way to vet. And I think that, again, it's easy to ask the questions. It's much harder to provide workable answers and solutions, I think, to them, for sure. So let me ask you this. So we just had a really good panel on transparency, about sort of the difficulty and the importance of opening up the social platforms, so that we can understand how they work under the hood, so that we can understand how they're using our data, so that we can understand how they're affecting society. And lawmakers, citizens, scientists, they've long called for more transparency, with regard to Facebook's algorithms. The Social Science One initiative initially stumbled, and then it came through with a large data set. As we all know, the Cambridge Analytica scandal started with Facebook sharing data with Cambridge University as an attempt to be transparent with an academic organization. So what's Facebook's position on algorithmic transparency, on understanding how the algorithms work? How can we achieve the right amount of transparency for society, for lawmakers, for citizens, for scientists, while protecting privacy? Is it differential privacy? Is that the solution? How do we scale this solution if there is one?
So look, I think there are several levels to this. Firstly, as far as users are concerned, the billions of folk who use Facebook apps, I think there is a huge challenge and a need for Facebook to really improve the transparency of the way in which particularly the algorithmic ranking process happens. So people have much more confidence that they know why they're seeing what they're seeing on their news feed, and that crucially they're in control of it. And I think we made some significant advances, not least recently. We have in effect now put in place, and you can scroll to the top of your newsfeed now, and you'll see that there's a sort of feed filter bar where you can toggle between sticking with your algorithmically curated newsfeed or switching, which you always could do, but it was always rather invisible. Now it's much more visible. You could switch to a chronological feed, or, which is much newer, you can basically compose your own feeds from your sort of your favorites, and you can sort of hand pick those. So you can basically override the algorithm. And at the same time, there's been this ability to, particularly through on the ads that you see, to see why am I seeing this? You just go on those 3 little dots and you can see why I'm seeing this. We're extending that significantly also to recommended content. So you'll see why is something being recommended to you. So I think there is a lot in the user experience that you can do to give people much greater sense of agency, transparency over their experience, and an ability and a sort of sovereignty over the content that they see, which, as I say, in some instances already means that you can, as a user, in effect, override the algorithm altogether. I have to say to you, here's my private pipe dream. I would love to get to a point where all of us who use Facebook would feel that we have, in effect, sort of dials, almost quite granular dials. I mean, I'm making this up a little bit for the sake of just trying to illustrate the point, but I would love us to move towards a situation where I could say, I want to see more sport, I turn the dial up. I want to see less politics, I turn the dial down. I want to see more cooking, I want to see less of this. I think if we could move to a direction where newsfeed in particular isn't an experience where people feel they're just being spoon-fed something by opaque automated systems, but they are really kind of composing their own newsfeed and able to really shift these dials. I think that would make a tremendous difference. I think at the same time, we need to give more access to data to researchers. I mean, that's obvious, and I don't need to say that to this audience. And you're quite right. We faltered a bit on all of this, and I think there've been good reasons. I don't think they're malign reasons. It's really difficult to square this circle. It really is that, and I feel this in my job constantly, speaking to policymakers. This constant tug of war between people saying, data intensive companies like Facebook, you should be giving away more data. Data should be much more portable. You should share much more of it. But of course, the more that data goes walkabout, the more risk there is to privacy. I mean, there just is a trade-off. I mean, there just is, and we can't deny that. And one of the things why we need, I think, new regulation is precisely to square this circle between the balance between data sharing and the risks inherent to privacy that is clearly involved. And that's in the research area as well. I hope, and I've certainly been very committed to this internally in the company, I hope the US 2020 research project, which we have worked with a number of independent researchers, and I hope they'll be independently, transparently. It's all their work. Hopefully they'll be publishing some of their early conclusions over the summer or autumn of this year. I hope that can become a blueprint for much more collaborative and effective research arrangements. And we have reorganized ourselves within the company to streamline a lot of the ways in which we provide data to researchers. And then the final thing I've alluded to earlier, it's not quite algorithmic transparency, but I don't want to lose sight of how I think significant it will be when Facebook, I believe, will be the first social media company not only to publish this reams of data that we do every 3 months, but to have that independently audited. That's never happened before, and we're in the process at the moment of finalizing who the independent auditor is and how they can operate and so on, to make sure that people feel that the data that they're looking at, on really fraught issues like harmful content and the systems that we use to remove that they really feel confident that the data is what it purports to be.
So you recently wrote a fascinating blog post, a long one, in fact. It was a big sort of public conversation starter that really pushed back against the idea that social media algorithms control us. And you reminded us that human agency matters in the outcomes that we see on social media. This is a perspective that I actually agree with very much. And I just want to show the audience a slide that puts up an image from your blog post. Let me just do that real quick. And I'll ask my colleagues here if this is working.
Yep, there it is.
Okay, perfect. So here's your image. And the point that you're making is that there's kind of been this zeitgeist in society that, the algorithms are controlling us. And you're saying, well, hang on a minute, there are choices that human beings are making in this process that lead to the outcomes. Now, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that this is the image from my book that was published well ahead of your blog post, I might add, about the dynamic interplay between machine intelligence and human behavior, between structure and agency. And we have very strict policies against plagiarism here at MIT, Nick. So I think we're going to have to investigate this after this conversation is over. But in all seriousness, you and I, in making this point, are sort of standing on the shoulders of giants of structuration theory and von Orlikovsky, applying that theory of the dynamic interplay between structure and agency, between machine intelligence and human behavior, in creating the outcomes that we see in society. Now, I want to be very specific, and I want to make sure that we have a concrete conversation about this. Because when you combine, a lot of the argument you make in your blog post is that, you make choices on who to follow, you make choices on which pages to choose, on which groups to join, and so on and so forth. And then those friends, groups, and pages feed a lot of the content that go into your news feed. But when you combine the people you may know algorithms, which recommend who to connect to, and the feed algorithms, which recommend the content to consume, doesn't the system have an outsized impact on where we place our attention? Is that a problem? And if so, what do you think Facebook should do to start addressing it?
Well, sorry, maybe I don't fully understand the question. I mean, the people you may know thing is just a classic example of what I was trying to illustrate in, you're quite right, that lengthy piece, and I will let the audience decide which of our graphics are better to illustrate the same point. But in a sense, they're both actually far too complicated, because simply what I was trying to say is, look, the algorithm is not sort of burrowing into your neural pathways and making you do stuff without any kind of human agency whatsoever. It's the interaction. I saw some critics saying, oh, Nick Clegg's blaming it all. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm simply saying it is an interaction. It is the interaction between these algorithmic ranking systems and our choices that is the fascinating thing. And it doesn't help us to move forward to deal with some of these societal issues by reducing some of that interaction to a caricature in which we say the machines are completely in control, which is why, candidly, some of the sort of zeitgeisty stuff I've seen over the last year or two of sort of, people in space or Star Trek suits in control rooms, pulling levers and making people sort of feel things, do things, act in a way which is completely beyond their own volition. I just think it's just a really unhelpful miscaricature of the interaction between the two. And People You May Know is a great example of that. People You May Know, for those who don't know or don't use this, it's literally just like a line of what looks like passport photographs that the Facebook systems say, look, here's someone you may be connected to because, I don't know, you went to university with them, or you went to school with them, or you're on the same groups. In fact, the one proof point that it uses, it says how many friends you share. But then it's entirely up to you. I mean, for what it's worth, I can't remember ever picking someone from People You May Know on my Facebook newsfeed. But it's then for you to choose whether you want to respond to that prompt or not. And I kind of don't think the People You May Know sort of tool, it's not forcing you. It's just saying, here are some people who you share friends with, and it actually shows you how many friends you share with. And then if you kind of think, oh God, I forgot about that person, yeah, I wouldn't mind sort of checking out how they're doing, and I'll double click on them, and you become a friend on Facebook. But it is in many ways, I think, almost a rather good example of the interaction. Now, I totally respect that some people say, oh, but I don't want to have any prompts. I don't want to have any automated prompts. I don't want to have any way in which, but as I try to explain in that, yes, forgive me, it was a slightly lengthy, but this is a complicated topic. We live in a universe now where we do rely on automated systems to make numerous suggestions to us to personalize the experiences that we have. And one of the great evolutions in the internet over the last decade or so is precisely a move towards great personalization. I mean, forget Facebook for a minute. I love Netflix. I watch Netflix. Netflix makes suggestions to me. They make suggestions to me based on what I've watched before. That's kind of logical. And I find that really helpful, because I wouldn't find it very helpful just to, every time I turn Netflix on, to be confronted with this encyclopedic sort of volume of unstructured choices. So, in one domain after the next, we are constantly being asked to make choices based on some level of automation, based on our previous preferences and likes and dislikes. And in Facebook, which of course is different to an open-ended recommendation engine. I mean, Facebook's not sort of fishing from an infinite amount of content in one sense, because it's bounded most heavily by who your friends are, which groups you're a member of, and which things you've commented and shared with in the past. And I think the point that you make, which is a legitimate one, which is the reasons why we've unveiled and introduced some of these new tools that I talked about a little earlier, is that we need to make sure that in that interaction between automated system and human being, that the human being feels that they know why they're being shown what they're shown, how they can control it, how they can override it, and how they can make their own personal choices. And I should, by the way, stress, I made this point in the essay. There are, I mean, some of the most popular apps that Facebook has, WhatsApp is notable amongst it, has no algorithm at all. I mean, there's no algorithmic curation going on at all. And yet we still have quite understandably issues of unpleasant content, hate speech, things being pinged from one person to the next. If it was only the algorithm that generated, baleful, unpleasant, hateful content, then we wouldn't see it on the non-algorithmic messaging apps, which are hugely, whether it's iMessage, Signal, Telegram, WhatsApp. So that's why I try to introduce this nuance. It's not trying to sort of shuffle off responsibility or certainly not blame anybody. It's just to try and describe the interaction between automated system and human being, and to increase the agency of the latter wherever we can.
Yeah, so I have to agree with you in the sense that the caricature of the algorithm controlling everything we see and everything we do is wrong. I also have to agree with you that in an era of information abundance, having recommendation algorithms is essential to making any meaningful sense of the vast amount of information that could go into our newsfeed. But I also think that the caricature of the other side, that the algorithms don't meaningfully structure what our choices are, is also wrong, in the sense that, having spoken to Facebook engineers, having researched the problem myself, even though you don't click on people you may know recommendations, the lion's share of new connections come from those recommendations, and the pages you follow, the groups that you're a part of, the friends that you make, which all come from recommendation algorithms, and those choices that you make, the choices you have to make there are limited in this vast abundance of information to the things that the algorithm recommends. So the caricature on the one end of the determinism of the algorithm is wrong, and the other caricature of it's all free choice and the algorithm really doesn't structure anything is also wrong, right? I think.
I agree with that, and look, I really do, and I hope, and I think it's a fair challenge that you make. But that's, by the way, and I hope you'll see this in the months to come. So one of the things that I've been pushing very hard in my role in Facebook is to make sure that we and I hope you'll see in the months to come that we become more and more we publish more information about how the distribution of problematic content is reduced on our platform, that we publish more on the data so people can understand what is really popular on newsfeed. I read a lot of stuff about people saying, Facebook is awash with ... which often doesn't actually conform to what most normal human beings are actually experiencing on Facebook. I think we can do more to be more open about the surveys that we launch, which we increasingly rely on. We rely on survey evidence where we ask people, what do you find inspiring? What do you find uplifting? What do you find useful? What do you find meaningful? I think we need to publish more of the signals and the predictions that guide newsfeed ranking. And so I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can and must and should do to, in a sense, lift the veil and to maybe just dispel some of the, because it's understandable. I get this. Why should anyone give a big global company like Facebook any benefit of the doubt? Of course they're not going to, and nor should they. And Facebook should rightly be under a lot of pressure to constantly explain itself, improve, and so on. But hopefully, by lifting the veil, sort of lifting the bonnet, if I can put it like that, on the kind of on the engine of particularly how algorithmic ranking works, we might be able to over time just dispel some of the, as I think you've suggested, some of the faintly sometimes ludicrous sort of cardboard cutout caricatures about all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good point that I agree with. The more transparency that you achieve, the more you can dispel some of these incorrect zeitgeists about, wow, like 99% of Facebook is misinformation or hate speech. We all know, well, the people who know that's wrong, but sometimes you need the transparency in order to put out the true percentages of content that are one way or the other.
Sure. But I mean, just since you mentioned it, I don't want to, but we have recently started publishing exactly in the spirit that you've recommended, prevalence numbers for hate speech. So how much hate speech is a sort of percentage of the total? And the latest figure we published is that hate speech constitutes 0.08% of sort of total newsfeed content. I wish it was zero. I don't think it will ever get right down to zero. But, and this comes back to my previous point, that is our data. That is our prevalence sort of estimate. We believe in the rigor of that data. We've got very rigorous data science teams who won't allow any of that data to be released unless they vetted it 1,000 different ways. But I totally accept the challenge that people will want, which comes back to our earlier discussion about independent audits, maybe some third-party institution, vetting for itself whether our data is sound, to have that kind of data confirmed independently, so that it hopefully gives people more reassurance than I think it is currently doing.
So let's talk about political polarization for a minute. So political polarization, it's a complex process with myriad causes. I doubt any serious scholar would claim that Facebook is solely responsible for political polarization. And many would argue it's not even clear that political polarization is on the rise globally. Although most evidence shows that affective political polarization, hatred of one party to another, is increasing in the United States. But all of this said, much, if not most, of the large-scale experimental evidence shows that recommendation algorithms cause a narrowing of content consumption and a divergence between different people's content consumption. Large-scale experiments on Facebook also show recommendation algorithms do increase affective political polarization. I'm thinking of Ro E. Levy's experiment when he was a PhD student at Yale. Does Facebook, which is, by the way, I think going to be published in the American Economic Review if it hasn't already been, does Facebook have a responsibility to address any polarizing effects it may have, or is this simply fair play?
Of course it does, and we've done considerable, and I think you're familiar with some of it. And our internal research, now this is going back a few years now, but I think we're in the process of refreshing this. But our internal research, and this has been confirmed by others, it's been confirmed by relatively recent research from Pew and from the Reuters Institute and so on, is that in a sense, directly contrary to the sort of widely made assertions, the evidence suggests that because the friends you have on Facebook tend to be sort of weak sociological connections, they're someone you worked with 10 years ago, a boyfriend or girlfriend you had, or a partner you had, 20 years later, someone you went to university with, lost contact with. It's kind of loose, it's weak connections. And given that it's the friends that you have on Facebook that determine the bulk of what you see on your newsfeed, actually the research shows that the ideological composition of that content is more diverse than if you only read the same partisan newspaper or watch the same cable news outlet, because those loose sociological connections tend to, of course, embrace people with a wide diversity of ideological views. And as you said, the Stanford research, which looked at, I think, 40 countries over 40 years, suggesting that actually many countries' polarization was going up before social media, and in some places actually stayed stable or gone down. So I think affective polarization is kind of, what do you think about people who don't share your point of view? You're right. I think in the US, but interestingly, the Stanford study.
You're talking about Genskow and Shapiro.
Yeah. The one in, I think it was 4 weeks before the 2018 midterms, where they had a bunch of people who just didn't use Facebook. They showed that it didn't actually reduce affective polarization. So interestingly, even if you were not using Facebook, your sentiment in that experiment, at least, towards people who don't, from a Democrat towards Republican, Republican towards Democrat, didn't go down. So that does suggest there's some pretty deep roots to this affective polarization, political polarization in the US. But look, that's what the research suggests. The research suggests that the kind of sources of polarization are much, much deeper. I mean, in my own country, I've heard people somehow suggest that social media is the reason for Brexit. I mean, it's an absurd thing to say. If you look at the history of Britain and Europe, Britain didn't join the European community in the post-war period because it was ambivalent about joining with its European members. This was in the 40s and the 50s, for heaven's sake. We had a completely different experience of the Second World War. The Conservative Party has been tearing itself to bits. I used to work, would you believe it, for a Conservative pro-European as an official in Brussels, all about, can't remember what it was, 25, 30 years ago now, well before I think Mark Zuckerberg had even thought of Facebook, and the party was being pulled limb from limb about Europe, and the Daily Mail has been campaigning on it for 40 years. So I just think I just think, of course, all of this shows up in social media. Of course, we must understand the role that social media plays. And yes, in answer to your question, of course, Facebook has a responsibility to understand and act on all of that. But I hope what we won't do, which I think sometimes does happen, and it's a totally normal human tendency, to try and use new technologies as a catch-all explanation for a bunch of really quite kind of complicated, forces which often have deeper socioeconomic origins and roots. And I think we always do that as human beings with technology. We want to kind of, we have this sort of reductionist tendency to say, I don't like something. It must be because of this kind of technology, which is opaque and I don't quite understand it. So it must be doing something I don't like. And I just don't think the evidence in this instance is borne out. But that doesn't mean we must continue doing the research. And Facebook, of course, bears a heavy responsibility at all times to make sure that we try and ensure that the experience people have on Facebook is safe, enjoyable, and uplifting.
So I want to make sure that I put on my objective scientist hat and do my job here and just clean a couple of things up. The research that you cite about whether it does or doesn't lead to quote unquote affective political polarization is not experimental. The experimental evidence where you actually randomize, shows that it leads to affective political polarization. And then this notion of having loose connections versus clustering of mutual friends. I think that the research there actually shows that recommendation algorithms lead to more clustering, shorter path links on Facebook than in general in society, and that having more of a kind of community online that's more people like yourself, homophilous communities, is part of the issue. But when it comes to political polarization at large, and I sort of open the question this way, lots of institutions seem to be contributing to political polarization in lots of ways. Take cable news networks, the research that you're talking about, internet, no internet, access to cable news or watching a lot of cable news or not watching a lot of cable news. The research shows all of that also is related to, political polarization. It's not just social media or just Facebook. Why aren't they being grilled like you? Why aren't they being grilled as much as Facebook is on this point?
I don't know. I mean, that's probably not for me to say. I think, as I say, I think there is a natural human tendency to say, oh, there's this new technology. I don't like it. I don't understand it. I'm going to just sort of, I'm going to freight it with all the kind of, with all the things that have gone wrong in the world. But look, can I just be clear? Because I agree with you. Of course, there's always nuances. So, for instance, I thought a really, really interesting, very recent study from the Berkman-Klein Institute in Harvard, which looked at where did most of the misinformation about mail-in ballots. There's this whole thing about all the misinformation about mail-in ballots. There's this terrible concern, quite rightly, that people were going to be discouraged from using mail-in ballots, and it became a highly politicized thing. They didn't find that social media played no role. They didn't say that, and I'm not saying that. But they did, and I think this is very significant. They said it played a distinctly secondary role, and that it was elite and mass media, particularly this feedback loop of partisan media outlets and cable news outlets, that really generated this vortex of misinformation about that. In fact, we, as you know, we might know, we created this, this very innovative voter information center, which hundreds of millions of Americans saw, to actually explain to them where to vote and how to use the mail-in ballot and to dispel all of that. And our evidence suggests that 4.5 million Americans were helped to register to vote because they saw that authoritative information on Facebook. So I'm not saying, of course, we play a part in that ecosystem. I just thought that was really revealing, because that is a very concrete example of misinformation, where a lot of the conventional narrative is, well, it must be because of social media, and where the academics in this instance said, of course, social media plays a role, but it's secondary. It's secondary to actually good old-fashioned cable TV and good old-fashioned partisan newspapers. And boy, I come from a country with some of the most aggressively partisan newspapers on the planet. If you only read The Sun, or you only read the Daily Mail, I guarantee that gives you a pretty particular worldview.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. We were talking about political polarization, and we sort of clarified that. This is about misinformation. When I think about The
Right.
misinformation around voter fraud, if you were to ask me what I think based on the research that I've seen is the leading cause of that, it would be political speech and media. And then everything else would be far lower in terms of that issue of election fraud in the 2020 election, mail-in ballots, and all the rest of it as well. Much less so Facebook, much more so politicians and the media outlets that talk about them. Let's switch to geopolitics for a minute. You sort of opened a little bit with this. So last week, China revealed its draft national personal information protection law, which limits how private companies can collect data. But obviously, it's widely known that the Chinese government has broad and basically unfettered access to vast amounts of consumer data. Europe has the GDPR. The US has this hodgepodge of 50 states privacy legislation led by California with some discussions about potentially a federal privacy legislation. So how do global platforms like Facebook navigate these varying frameworks for privacy and data protection? Do you just have to go with, whatever is the least common denominator, the most restrictive, and apply that to all consumers' data? Or do you just have to develop different and adapting policies in every geopolitical area?
Well, I mean, this is what I spend most of my time on. It's my day job, really. I lead the policy teams at Facebook, and we're engaging, as you can imagine, in a sort of dizzying Rubik's cube of different sort of regulations and around the world. As I say, I think it's high time that. I mean, this pendulum has swung so violently from sort of tech euphoria and tech utopianism in the past, where people like, Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg could do no wrong. And it's now swung almost to the other extreme, where it's sort of hysterical tech pessimism, where every problem in the world is ascribed to tech. Neither extreme, of course, are true. And I don't think the pendulum will come to rest until the power and influence of companies like Facebook is framed in sensible regulation. And that's what we're now embarked on. And to your question, how do we navigate all of that? Well, I actually think we won't know. I think the next few years are going to be vital, are going to be absolutely vital. Are we going to end up in a world where basically the global internet as we know it just becomes ever more fragmented? We're seeing some worrying signs. I'll give you two examples. The Indian government is possibly over the summer going to pass legislation to insist that data on global platforms remains in India. That the sort of data cake is kept in national data, cake slices, what's called data localization. I think if India does that, I think many other jurisdictions will follow. And before you know it, the seamless flow of data will be interrupted by just, lots and lots of separate different silos. At the same time, you have some of the people listening to this may be familiar with this. You have this long-running saga. I remember it from my own time, my 10 years in Brussels as a European Commission official and then a member of the European Parliament many years ago. There's this whole issue of a number of European Court of Justice rulings which have struck down the arrangements that guarantee the open flow of data across the Atlantic between the EU and the US. Anyway, it's now got to a point where the latest legal instrument, they're called standard contract clauses, which thousands, we use them, but thousands of companies use them. We're in the front line of this because the Irish Data Protection Commissioner has said that we need to review the use of the standard contract clauses, but we're just the front of the queue, we're just the front of the line. If basically it becomes no longer legally possible to transmit data across the Atlantic, we could see just at the time when both the American and European economies need to recover from this pandemic shock, you could literally just see data flows being switched off. And there's a very genuine prospect that this might happen because the American and European governments have not been able to, and the EU not been able to come up with a successor regime to something called Privacy Shield. But these are just two examples of how both by accident or by design, far from having a consistent approach where people, it's why we've long advocated if people are going to embark upon privacy legislation, the closer they can hew to the best in class, which at the moment is GDPR, the better. Because if we can, it's why Facebook, I think other companies welcomed the legislation, the statewide legislation in Virginia recently, because it was pretty closely modeled on GDPR. The more, and I think Europe is a leader here. Europe can set standards which then become emulated around the world. The more that can be the approach, rather than everyone inventing their own thing, the more we can avoid this truly perilous risk to the open internet.
I mean, what happens when, they set data standards that you can't, reasonably and morally comply with, and then they grow in other countries their own Facebooks and Twitters and so on, and now we have a balkanized information ecosphere. How does that affect our ability as humans to collaborate and cooperate on global issues like climate change, when we all are faced with completely different information sets? And our citizenry has different opinions based on completely different versions of information in their various information ecosystems. Can we collaborate on global challenges if that happens?
Well, I mean, I don't think we should measure this by the degree to which new companies could offer new innovation. I mean, that's a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing that, Facebook has new competitors like TikTok and great competitors like Snapchat, and obviously traditional competitors like YouTube and Twitter. I mean, I don't think the measure is whether there's more. There should be more competition. That's a totally legitimate aspiration. It's I'm a senior executive of Facebook, but I'm also European. I love Europe to be the home for the next generation of Alibabas, Googles, Amazons, and so on. And so I don't think that's the test. The test more is, I think the acid test is, do we keep data flows open? If you basically start making the flow of data something subject to the whims and wishes of, political control, I think you first risk greater sort of authoritarian intrusion into privacy, because, of course, I mean, let's be candid. One of the reasons why data localization, which sounds terribly benign and technical, is popular amongst in some countries is precisely because the powers that be believe that if the data can be kept under lock and key in their jurisdiction, they can send their equivalent to the data police to go in and have a good snoop at what is in those data sets. So first, I think it would be an incursion to liberty and privacy. But secondly, it would be an erosion of that extraordinary thing that we've seen over the last 15 years. Whatever flaws have emerged over the last decade and a half, it is just fantastic that people can, for free, certainly in Facebook's case, because it's all paid for by advertising, can communicate and express themselves when they like, to whom they like, wherever they like, at whatever time of day or night, regardless of where you are, regardless of your economic circumstances. That is amazing. It's one of the reasons I work here. I still think it's amazing. I think we'll look back on this, even despite all the angst about social media, and think, wow, that was amazing. We could suddenly do that. And I hope that won't be lost, because I think there is a genuine risk that it might be in the years to come.
Nick, I think that's a really good place to end. I know you're really busy. I know you've got places to go now. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with us, and the fact that you take this time to have these conversations all the time. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Likewise. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Sinan. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody. Close of the Fireside. More to come.